Before he became the monarch who treated marriage like a demolition derby, Henry VIII was England's golden boy. Picture this: broad-shouldered, reddish-gold hair flowing like the cover of a medieval romance novel, and legs for days. Henry was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in Europe. And yes, that matters, because in the 1500s your calves were propaganda. Young Henry didn't expect to be king. His older brother Arthur was the heir, while Henry was the spare, destined for a life in the church, not the crown. So naturally, he was educated like a clergyman, which meant he could actually read, speak Latin, and compose music. Yes, Henry wrote love songs. Try reconciling that with the image of a guy who would later invent nationalized divorce and have his wife beheaded for adultery. Henry wasn't just looking for love. He was looking for a uterus with a throne warranty. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, how Henry VIII's marriages rewrote the nation's history, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Surprisingly, the crown came calling early. Arthur inconveniently passed away after just a few months of marriage. Maybe from illness, maybe from Tudor-level wedding night pressure. Suddenly, teenage Henry was the next in line, and everything changed. By age 17, he was crowned king, and the pageantry was something out of a medieval fever dream. Think jousting, feasting, and enough gold embroidery to bankrupt a small kingdom. Henry wasn't just young and attractive, he was obsessed with the idea of legacy. And in Tudor England, legacy didn't mean building a nice library and sponsoring the arts, although, to be fair, he did dabble in both. It meant producing a male heir. Girls were lovely, sure, but in the minds of the Tudor elite, they were about as helpful as a candle in a hurricane. Women couldn't rule without plunging the country into supposed chaos, or so they believed. This paranoia wasn't entirely Henry's fault. The War of the Roses, a brutal civil war between rival branches of the royal family, had ended just a generation earlier. Henry's father, Henry VII, had won the throne by beating the living scones out of everyone else in line. That meant Henry VIII had royal blood, but just barely. His claim to the throne was about as stable as a three-legged stool after a tavern brawl. So from day one, Henry's job was clear: secure the Tudor dynasty. And in his mind, that required a male heir, no exceptions. Having a daughter? That was nice. Having a son? That was insurance. Now, let's talk about Henry's personality. At first, he seemed like the ideal Renaissance king. He loved learning, music, architecture, and theology. He was genuinely intelligent, writing treatises defending Catholicism before he did a full 180, and tore the whole system down. He also loved jousting, hunting, and banquets that involved things like sugar sculptures of entire villages, just in case dessert didn't already feel overcompensating enough. But underneath all that polish there was a deep insecurity, a fear that if he didn't produce a strong male heir, his entire legacy, everything his father fought for, would vanish. The Tudor name would become just another footnote in the long, messy saga of English monarchs. That pressure made Henry dangerous, because when a man believes the future of an entire nation depends on his personal romantic satisfaction, you can bet someone's going to lose their head eventually. Of course, Henry didn't start as a tyrant. Early in his reign, he was popular. People actually liked him. He reduced taxes, spoke to crowds, even dabbled in poetry. He was the people's king until those people started getting in the way of his personal goals. It turns out that popularity has a shelf life when you're marrying for heirs and rearranging religion on a whim. And let's not forget the court, the glamorous, gossip-fueled hotbed where power plays were served hotter than roast boar. Everyone wanted a piece of Henry's attention. If you were young, ambitious, and had the right family connections, or just happened to look really good in velvet, you were suddenly a potential queen. Courtship wasn't romantic, it was survival. And for Henry, it was recruitment. But despite the banquets, the flattery, and the carefully orchestrated marriages, one fact kept haunting him. He kept producing daughters or dead infants, and in his mind, That wasn't just misfortune, it was divine judgment. Maybe God was punishing him, or maybe it was the wives. Either way, Henry decided that the only logical solution was to keep trying. Over the course of his reign, Henry would go from charming golden boy to paranoid monarch, convinced that only he knew the will of God. He started with a burning desire for love, sons, and a permanent place in history. What he ended up with was a national schism, 6 wives, and the kind of legacy that makes high school history teachers sweat, trying to explain it all in one class period. And that legacy, it all started here with a charismatic young king, a crushing sense of dynastic pressure, and the stubborn belief that if the church said no, the crown could simply build its own altar. Before the messy royal divorces trend, there was Catherine of Aragon, Princess of Spain, Queen of England, and unwitting co-star in the slow-burning constitutional crisis that would leave the Catholic Church clutching its pearls. Catherine wasn't some nobody plucked from a minor noble house. No, she was royalty with a capital R, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Yes, that Ferdinand and Isabella, the ones who sponsored Columbus, kicked out the Moors and basically steamrolled Spain into the early modern era. Catherine came with a resume longer than a medieval tapestry, connected to gain power, impeccably Catholic, and trained from birth to be a queen. She didn't just marry power, she was power. Originally she was married to Henry's older brother Arthur. That arrangement lasted less than 5 months before Arthur mysteriously passed away, possibly from the sweating sickness, which sounds exactly as pleasant as it reads. But Catherine remained in England, her dowry unpaid and her future in limbo, widowed, young and surrounded by suspicious in-laws. Not exactly the dream. Enter Henry, 5 years her junior and now the heir to the throne. He eventually married Catherine in 1509, shortly after he became king. The match made sense. It kept the alliance with Spain intact, kept Catherine's substantial dowry in play, and made Henry look like a dutiful younger brother. But beneath the royal gloss was a legal loophole the size of Westminster Abbey, because marrying your brother's widow was a biblical grey area. To get around that, Catherine swore up and down that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Henry believed her, or at least pretended to, and the Pope granted a special dispensation. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. At first the marriage seemed promising. Catherine was intelligent, dignified, and took to the role of queen with ease. She knew how to run a court, how to win over the people, and how to keep Henry's more extravagant impulses from getting too ridiculous, which, in hindsight, was a losing battle. She even acted as regent when Henry was off trying and mostly failing to win military glory in France. During one of those absences, she led the defence against a Scottish invasion, sending the King of Scots home in a body bag. Not bad for a woman forced to learn English as an adult, but behind closed doors the royal nursery was the site of silent heartbreak. Catherine became pregnant at least 6 times, some sources say more, but only one child, Mary, survived infancy. The rest were either stillborn or passed away shortly after birth. In an era where motherhood was essentially your job description as queen, that wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a crisis. Henry grew increasingly restless. Every new pregnancy rekindled hope. Every miscarriage was a blow to his dynasty. As he moved into his 30s and saw his peers producing bouncing baby boys left and right, his confidence began to crack. This wasn't the Henry of youthful optimism. This was a man slowly unraveling under the weight of legacy. Catherine, for her part, remained steadfast. She never stopped presenting herself as the king's lawful wife and rightful queen. She remained gracious, pious, and perhaps most maddening to Henry, utterly unwilling to disappear quietly. Catherine gave him loyalty, stability, and a daughter, but Henry wanted a son, not a Spanish lesson in patience. Catherine's unwavering dignity might have impressed saints, but it grated on a king who had begun to convince himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. He became obsessed with a single line from Leviticus 20:21, which warns that a man who marries his brother's wife will be childless. The theological gymnastics that followed make modern conspiracy theories look like bedtime stories. In truth, Henry wasn't just interpreting scripture. He was looking for a legal way out. He had his eye on a younger, livelier woman named Anne Boleyn, but more on her later. The key thing here is that Henry began pushing for an annulment, insisting that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the eyes of God. And this is where things go from marital squabble to national meltdown. Because Catherine? She refused. She appealed to the Pope. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated. She demanded public hearings. She defended her daughter's legitimacy. And she did it all in flawless Latin, reminding everyone that while Henry might be king, she was no disposable side character. The Pope, caught between a rock and a very Catholic Spain, stalled, and Henry, infuriated by Rome's inaction, began to take matters into his own hands. Thus, the so-called King's Great Matter wasn't just a marital crisis, it was the slow, grinding birth of a revolution in English governance and religion. Henry's desire to end his marriage sparked debates about royal supremacy, papal authority, and whether or not a king could override centuries of church tradition with a well-timed hissy fit. And at the center of it all was Catherine. Calm, composed, and utterly immovable. She would eventually be cast aside, banished from court, and forced to live out her days in cold, draughty castles. But she never stopped calling herself queen. She never acknowledged Anne Boleyn's legitimacy. And she never, not once, cursed her husband in public, which is more than we can say for what Henry did to her legacy. At some point in his midlife spiral, Henry VIII decided that the biggest obstacle to his happiness wasn't fate, poor medical science, or the fact that his expectations for wives were wildly unrealistic. No, it was the Pope, and thus began the most aggressively dramatic breakup in church history. To be fair, Henry didn't start off intending to flip the table on 1,500 years of Christian authority. All he wanted was an annulment, a retroactive spiritual delete button, so he could pretend his 20-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon had never happened. It wasn't technically a divorce. It was more like saying, sorry, that whole wedding? Yeah, God wasn't paying attention that day. Can we just act like it didn't count? The argument hinged on the claim that his marriage to Catherine had violated God's law, because she'd previously been married to his brother. Henry suddenly became a part-time theologian, thumbing through Leviticus and dusting off biblical interpretations like a student who hadn't done the reading but still insisted on leading the debate. He latched onto one particular verse like it was divine fine print. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He shall be childless. Never mind that he wasn't technically childless. Mary existed, and quite stubbornly at that. But Henry declared her illegitimate, so he could paint himself as a victim of God's displeasure. Because when you're king and you're not getting your way, suddenly scripture becomes less of a sacred text and more of a legal loophole. Enter Pope Clement VII, who found himself in the kind of tight spot that would make any world leader sweat, grant Henry his annulment, and alienate Spain, one of the most powerful Catholic empires in Europe, or deny the annulment and face the full pouty wrath of the English crown. Here's where things got especially awkward. Catherine's nephew was none other than Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. You know, the guy who basically owned Europe at the time. And Charles had recently taken Rome itself in a dramatic act of imperial chest-beating. The Pope? Yeah, he was more or less Charles's hostage, not metaphorically. Literally. Like, please don't burn down my basilica again. Levels of awkward. So the Pope stalled and hedged, and offered Henry a series of deeply unsatisfying compromises that all boiled down to no, but politely. This was the point where Henry VIII stopped trying to work within the system and started building his own. He didn't reform the church, he rage-quit Catholicism like a medieval gamer yanking the cord out. At first, Henry tried diplomacy. He sent scholars to Rome, he held legal proceedings in England, he hired Europe's best lawyers and several second-best theologians. He tried pressuring clergy to take his side. But when none of that worked, and when Anne Boleyn's patience began wearing thinner than Henry's hairline, he pulled the royal trump card. In a stunning act of innovation, or catastrophic ego depending on your perspective, Henry declared that the Pope had no authority in England. If the Pope wouldn't annul his marriage, then England would simply stop recognizing the Pope. Problem solved. Reformation born. And just like that, Henry became supreme head of the Church of England, which sounds holy and majestic until you realize that the whole thing was basically built to fast-track a divorce. This wasn't Martin Luther hammering theses to church doors over issues of indulgences. This wasn't a mass movement of theological rebellion. This was one man with a crown, a legal team, and a serious case of marital impatience. The English Reformation didn't begin with a monk's sermon. It began with a frustrated husband holding a grudge against Italian bureaucracy. To get this done, Henry passed the Act of Supremacy in 1534, declaring himself the head of the Church of England. He also passed the Act of Succession, requiring everyone to acknowledge his marriage to Anne Boleyn and reject the Pope's authority, or risk being charged with treason, which came with the charming punishment of being hanged, drawn and quartered. The clergy, forced to choose between loyalty to the Pope or survival. The bishops, most caved, except for Sir Thomas More, who famously refused and got himself beheaded for his principles, because nothing says sainthood like refusing to sign a divorce form. And the people of England? Confused, mostly. One minute they're praying to saints, the next minute they're told that's heresy. One week the monasteries are open, the next they're being dismantled brick by agents of the crown. The Reformation didn't just change doctrine, it ripped through daily life like a theological tornado. And at the center of it all was Henry, smugly remarried and wielding a religious system tailored to his personal needs. Of course, Henry didn't actually change that much about the church itself. Mass was still in Latin, priests still wore robes, nobody was passing out pamphlets about salvation through grace alone. It wasn't so much Protestantism as it was Catholicism with a custom logo and fewer Italians. But the consequences were seismic. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized and redistributed to loyal nobles. This wasn't just spiritual reform, it was a full-blown nationalization of religion. The Church of England became both a religious and power weapon, with Henry at the helm and no pope left to veto his romantic decisions. And all of this, all of it, because one man couldn't secure an annulment. If Catherine of Aragon was the portrait of royal dignity, Anne Boleyn was the spark in the powder keg. She was everything Catherine wasn't. Younger, sharper, Protestant curious, and about as subtle as a cannonball in a library. While Catherine clung to tradition, Anne kicked it off the throne in heels and said, "Make way." Anne didn't start at the top. She wasn't even meant to be queen. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a well-connected courtier, but hardly from royal stock. Her family had ambition oozing from every pore, and Anne was their golden ticket. She was educated in the Netherlands and France, fluent in French, trained in courtly manners, music and fashion. She was cosmopolitan in a court full of fur-lined dinosaurs, and most importantly, she knew how to work a room. By the time she returned to England and entered Queen Catherine's court as a lady-in-waiting, Anne was already a power time bomb in a silk bodice. She wasn't classically beautiful, but she had presence. People either adored her or hated her, and many did both before lunch. Henry VIII, for his part, was instantly smitten, but Anne wasn't interested in being his mistress. No, she'd seen what happened to her sister Mary Boleyn, who had already warmed the royal sheets and been unceremoniously discarded. Anne wanted more, much more. She told Henry, "No ring, no thing," which in royal terms translates to, "Put a crown on it," or "Stop writing me love letters in embarrassingly bad French." Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter, rebranded his church, and still got the worst breakup in history, decapitation. So Henry chased her for 7 years. During that time, Anne became not just the object of his obsession, but the voice in his ear. She actively pushed for the break from Rome. She surrounded herself with scholars and religious thinkers sympathetic to reform, people who believed the Pope had too much power and that the scriptures should be in English. Anne wasn't simply Henry's romantic partner. She was the ideological co-pilot of England's spiritual rebellion. And when Henry finally did break with Rome, toss Catherine aside and crown Anne his queen in 1533, it was a victory for them both. She had won the most coveted and dangerous position in England, but the crown was heavy, and it came with an expiration date. Anne's coronation was lavish, dramatic, and incredibly awkward. Many of the nobles still considered Catherine the rightful queen. The people weren't exactly thrilled either. You could hear the gritted teeth from Calais. Still, Anne walked through London like she owned it, because for a brief, blazing moment she did. She was pregnant when crowned, a PR masterstroke. The nation held its breath, expecting a male heir to justify every scandal and severed tie. But in a move that could only be described as cosmically ironic, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth, who would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. But to Henry, she might as well have been a polite shrug in a cradle. From there, it went downhill fast. Anne had a temper like a furnace and a sharp tongue to match. She made enemies with dazzling efficiency. Courtiers whispered, nobles bristled, and even her allies began to shift uneasily in their silk doublets. Henry, who once composed ballads for her, now saw her as a liability with a crown. To make things worse, Anne had multiple miscarriages after Elizabeth, each one chipping away at her power value. In the Tudor court, love could be passionate, but power was transactional, and Anne's account was quickly running dry. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's right-hand man and master of power cleanup. Anne had quarrelled with him one too many times, and now he was sharpening his knives, figuratively, for now. What followed was one of the most breathtaking character assassinations in English history. Anne was arrested in 1536 and charged with adultery, incest, and plotting the king's passings, basically the Renaissance version of all of the above. The accusations were absurd. Her alleged lovers included her own brother George Boleyn and half the men in her social circle, one of whom was famously terrified of her and refused to even make eye contact. The evidence was thin, contradictory, and probably made up on a long walk to the Tower. But this was not about proof. It was about removal. Anne was tried in a public court. She defended herself with grace, fire, and the kind of cutting wit that probably sealed her fate. Convicted on all charges, she was sentenced to death. Henry, in a rare moment of faux mercy, hired a skilled French swordsman to execute her cleanly. No axe, no botched swing, just one precise stroke. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn stepped onto the scaffold, wearing a grey damask gown, holding a prayer book, and gave a final speech that walked the tightrope between courage and compliance. She praised the king, asked for prayers, and knelt. The sword fell. She was just 35 years old. Anne's passings was the closing chapter of a romance that had literally rewritten the laws of England and torn the country from the Catholic Church. She had gambled everything, and for a time she had won. But in Tudor England, the higher you climbed, the closer your neck got to the executioner's blade. If Anne Boleyn was all fire and fury, Jane Seymour was a strategically timed bucket of cold water. She entered Henry VIII's life like a whisper after a thunderclap, and by Tudor standards, that made her positively irresistible. No drama, no faction dragging behind her, just the quiet promise of domestic bliss, and more importantly, a functioning womb with good PR. Jane didn't have the exotic flair of Anne or the royal pedigree of Catherine. She was the daughter of a country knight from Wiltshire, raised in a modest but respectable household. Her greatest assets weren't wealth or beauty, but obedience and timing, and she wielded both with the skill of a woman who knew exactly what kind of king she was dealing with, and oh, what timing it was. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on May 19, 1536. Jane Seymour was betrothed to the king on May 20. Yes, the very next day. It was less grieving widower and more doorbuster wedding sale. The ink on the execution order wasn't even dry, and Henry was already shopping for cradle decor. Jane gave Henry the one thing he wanted most, a son, and the second thing he didn't realize he wanted, no backtalk. Jane's appeal was simple. She was the anti-Anne, submissive, soft-spoken, and as quiet as the grave she'd soon occupy. In court she wore modest clothing, avoided scandals, and kept her opinions tucked safely behind tight-lipped smiles. It was less queen consort and more emotionally available wallpaper, and Henry adored her for it. But let's not sell Jane short. She wasn't stupid, she was calculated. She'd served both Catherine and Anne as lady-in-waiting, and knew exactly how dangerous proximity to Henry could be. So when he began showing interest, she didn't throw herself into his arms. She played the game Anne had once perfected, offering herself just far enough to keep his obsession growing, while withholding enough to make him work for it. For a king used to instant gratification, it was irresistible. Their marriage was brief, by royal standards. Jane was queen for only 17 months, but what she accomplished in that short time would echo through English history, because in October of 1537, Jane did what no wife before her could. She gave birth to a healthy son. Cue the royal parade. Trumpets blared. Bells rang across England. Nobles wept with joy and possibly relief. After decades of dynastic anxiety and 2 wives sacrificed to the royal heir hunt, Edward VI was born, and with him the future of the Tudor line. Henry was beside himself with joy. He finally had what he wanted, a legitimate male heir, and he made sure the entire kingdom knew it. The christening was an elaborate ceremony with all the trimmings, nobility, incense, and enough velvet to upholster a fleet of galleons. Jane, exhausted and pale, was wheeled in on a special platform just to witness the moment. But while Henry was planning Edward's future, Jane was dying in the background. The cause? Likely puerperal fever, a postpartum infection so common and deadly at the time it might as well have been listed in baby books. Medical knowledge in the 16th century was roughly on par with throwing herbs at a wound and hoping for divine intervention. Jane's delivery had been long and difficult, and hygiene standards at court weren't exactly Florence Nightingale levels of clean. Within 2 weeks she was gone. Henry, devastated, or at least as devastated as a man with a newly secured dynasty could be, actually mourned her. Unlike his previous wives, Jane received the royal treatment in death. He wore mourning clothes, retreated from court life for a time, and didn't remarry for several years. For a king who usually moved on with the emotional grace of a cannonball, this was practically grief poetry. More importantly, Jane was the only wife buried alongside him at Windsor Castle. That's right, out of 6 women, Jane got the prime burial real estate. When Henry passed away, he was laid next to her, his choice made years in advance. Was it love, or did he just appreciate the fact that she never contradicted him and passed away conveniently after doing her royal duty? History shrugs. Jane's legacy wasn't fiery speeches or political intrigue. It was Edward, the fragile prince who would briefly rule after Henry's death and drag England into its next chapter of religious roulette. Jane's success came not from dazzling the court or dominating headlines, but from playing the long game quietly and winning before she even knew the rules. Her story is one of quiet competence in a world that rarely valued it. In a court filled with ambition, seduction, and blood-soaked ladders to power, Jane was a ladder disguised as a prayer bench. She didn't make waves. She made a king stop looking, and in Tudor England, that was the most dangerous power of all. By the time Anne of Cleves entered the picture, Henry VIII had 3 wives behind him, 2 buried, 1 banished, and a reputation that made most European princesses clutch their pearls and decline the invitation. But Henry wasn't giving up. He still didn't have a backup son in case Edward caught a cold, and the shifting sands of European politics meant it was time for another strategic marriage. This one would be less about love and more about allies. Enter the Duchy of Cleves, a Protestant German state strategically nestled in the Holy Roman Empire. Marrying into this region was Henry's attempt to cozy up to the Lutheran side of Europe, especially now that the Pope considered him about as Catholic as a meat pie on a Friday. The candidate was Anne of Cleves, sister to Duke William, and critically completely unknown to Henry. So how does a 16th century king evaluate his future wife without FaceTime, Instagram, or even a slightly misleading profile bio? Easy. he commissions a painting. Henry sent Hans Holbein the Younger, his most trusted court artist and part-time flattery specialist, to Cleves to paint Anne's portrait. The result? A pleasant-looking, modestly dressed woman with gentle eyes and no glaring disfigurements. Henry took one look at the painting and said, more or less, "Yeah, I'd wife that." Spoiler, he shouldn't have. Anne of Cleves was smart enough to leave the marriage alive, rich and drama-free, a Tudor unicorn. Anne arrived in England in late 1539, and Henry, ever the romantic, decided to surprise her in disguise, because nothing says "I'm ready to commit" like role-playing as a random courtier and sneaking up on your bride in a foreign country. Unfortunately, Anne didn't react the way he wanted. Instead of falling into his arms with swoons and sighs, she looked confused, slightly horrified even. She didn't know it was him. She didn't even really like him. She just stared at this sweaty, middle-aged man who had barged into her chambers smelling like horses and roast duck. Henry took this as a personal affront, and things only got worse. When he finally met her officially, he reportedly muttered to his advisors, "I like her not," which is 16th century speak for "this date is not going well." In person, Anne wasn't quite the Holbein dream girl. She was tall, awkward, and unfamiliar with English customs. Her German fashion choices didn't help. One observer compared her clothes to curtains having a nervous breakdown. Now, was she truly unattractive? Probably not. Contemporary accounts were mixed. Some found her pleasant, others underwhelming. But let's be honest, Henry was looking for excuses, and Anne's real crime was not immediately stroking his ego. Despite his cold feet, the political alliance was already in motion. The wedding went ahead on January 6, 1540, and it was, by all accounts, the most awkward honeymoon since the invention of separate bedrooms. Henry claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage because Anne was so unattractive it chilled his desires. Others suggested he was having his own royal performance issues. Either way, the marriage remained unconsummated, and Henry started looking for an exit plan before the ink on the marriage license dried. By summer, he had made up his mind. The match was to be annulled, and this time he had a new excuse. Anne had been previously betrothed to another noble years ago, though nothing had come of it. That was enough for Henry to declare the marriage invalid. No sword, no scandal, just paperwork. But here's where Anne really shines. Rather than object or fight, she agreed, cheerfully, graciously. She didn't demand anything. She didn't cry or cling. She nodded, signed the annulment, and walked out of the palace with a massive settlement, several castles, a lifelong income, and the new title of King's beloved sister. Anne of Cleves played the most dangerous game at court, and walked away not only alive but upgraded. She wasn't banished to a convent or quietly poisoned. She got a nice country estate, invitations to royal events, and enough financial security to never have to deal with Henry's snoring or mood swings again. And the English people? They loved her. After the drama of Anne Boleyn and the tragedy of Jane Seymour, Anne's peaceful exit was a breath of fresh air. She visited Elizabeth and Edward, maintained cordial relations with Henry, and lived a quiet, respected life for another 17 years, outlasting all of Henry's other wives. She even managed to avoid being dragged into the political mess of Henry's later years. She didn't remarry. She didn't seek power. She just existed, in comfort, in peace, with a palace full of tapestries and not a single executioner in sight. In a court where marrying Henry usually came with a countdown timer, Anne of Cleves pulled off the impossible. She made it to the credits without a dramatic final act. Anne's story proves that in the wild world of Tudor politics, the real power move wasn't seduction or defiance, it was survival. And sometimes, the smartest thing you can do is smile, nod, and sign the annulment papers. By the time Catherine Howard caught Henry VIII's eye, he was no longer the dashing heartthrob who jousted for fun and composed love songs. He was in his late 40s, chronically ill, ulcer-ridden, bloated from banquets, and nursing a leg wound that smelled like it had personal opinions. He looked less like a king and more like a roast goose with a crown. So what did Henry do? Naturally, he married a teenager. Marrying a teenager when you're over 40 and full of gout? That's not romance. It's a royal midlife crisis. Catherine Howard, about 17 years old at the time, was everything Henry wasn't. Young, lively, flirtatious, and able to walk up a staircase without a team of servants and a prayer. She was also the first cousin of Anne Boleyn, because apparently Henry was collecting Boleyn relatives like limited edition goblets. Catherine had been raised in the household of the Duchess of Norfolk, which was more free-range chaos than strict moral instruction. Her education was minimal, her supervision spotty at best. The Duchess had a rotating staff, and Catherine's sleeping arrangements often involved shared quarters, thin curtains, and very few questions asked. By the time she arrived at court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Catherine already had several romantic entanglements in her rear-view mirror, including one with a music tutor and another with a gentleman named Francis Derham, who fancied himself more than just a fling. These past relationships would later resurface like badly buried secrets, but at the time they were brushed aside until they weren't. Henry, predictably, was enchanted. Catherine was referred to as his rose without a thorn, which is a bold claim for someone who'd never done a background check. Within months of Anne of Cleves being shipped off with her castle and pension, Henry married Catherine in 1540, throwing another lavish celebration that looked less like a wedding and more like the king desperately trying to turn back the clock. At first, Catherine leaned into her role as queen. She wore dazzling gowns, entertained courtiers, and called Henry her sweetheart. She even managed to overlook the fact that her new husband had the romantic appeal of a wounded badger and spent more time praying for heir insurance than making conversation. But beneath the silks and smiles, Catherine was still a teenager, and one with a deeply flawed understanding of what queen actually meant. She started flirting, openly, often, boldly, and with men who absolutely should have known better. One of the most prominent was Thomas Culpeper, a member of Henry's privy chamber, handsome, charming, and dangerously available. The two allegedly met in secret, sometimes with the help of one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, who really should have invested in a better sense of self-preservation. Now it's important to understand, in the Tudor court, flirting wasn't just gossip, it was treason adjacent. When you were queen, your private life was a matter of national security. Every look, every whisper, every late-night hallway encounter could be interpreted as a plot against the throne, especially when your husband had already beheaded one wife for less. The situation unraveled fast. Francis Derham showed up, claiming he'd been promised marriage by Catherine before she became queen, and helpfully added that he'd known her in the biblical sense. The court, sensing blood in the water and a promotion if they played their cards right, jumped into action. Investigations were launched, letters were discovered, interrogations were held. Catherine's past, which she had so carefully hidden behind jeweled gowns and courtly dances, came crashing down like a chandelier at a royal ball. She was arrested in November 1541, barely a year after becoming queen. Henry's reaction was dramatic. He reportedly wept, raged, isolated himself, and cursed the day he met her. Whether it was genuine heartbreak or wounded pride is anyone's guess. But for Catherine, it was game over. She was imprisoned in Sion Abbey, a former convent turned holding cell, and spent her final days in terror. Witnesses said she screamed so loudly from her chambers that people outside the walls could hear. She had no allies, no powerful family shielding her this time. The Howard name, already tainted by Anne Boleyn's downfall, was now political poison. On February 13, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. She was not yet 20 years old. Her final words were haunting. "I passed away a queen, but I would rather have passed away the wife of Culpeper." A tragic confession, or perhaps just a poetic fabrication historians can't resist repeating. Either way, she met her end with what little dignity could be scraped together in the shadow of an axe. Her head rolled, the executioner cleaned his blade, and the crown returned, once again, to Henry's shelf of failed romances. Catherine Howard's story isn't just a royal tragedy. It's a cautionary tale of youth, power, and the terrifying weight of being young in a world where your beauty was both weapon and liability. She wasn't raised to rule, she was raised to entertain, and that, in the Tudor court, was a fatal education. By the time Catherine Parr entered the marital death maze known as Henry VIII's love life, the warning signs were not so much subtle red flags as giant flaming banners embroidered with the word "run." 5 wives had already walked the line, 2 divorced, 2 decapitated, 1 dead in childbirth, and Henry himself was now less a romantic prospect and more a medically complicated sack of power and paranoia. And yet Catherine said yes. Why? Because Catherine Parr wasn't just any courtier. She was clever, composed, and one of the most intellectually formidable women ever to wear a Tudor crown. She knew exactly what she was getting into, and she prepared like she was entering a royal hostage situation with homework. Catherine Parr treated Henry's wounds, dodged a heresy charge, and outlived him, basically the final girl of the Tudor horror film. Born in 1512, Catherine came from noble stock, but she wasn't raised to be queen. She had already been married twice by the time Henry noticed her, and unlike his previous wives, her first 2 husbands had gone of natural causes, which in Tudor terms practically made her a unicorn. Widowed by 31, she had no children, but plenty of experience managing households, estates, and old cranky men, which is exactly what Henry had become. By the 1540s, Henry was physically falling apart. He had a festering leg ulcer that stank so badly courtiers could smell it from across the room. He was obese, temperamental, and paranoid enough to suspect treason if someone buttered his bread the wrong way. He didn't need a passionate lover or a dazzling debutante. He needed a nurse, a therapist, a scholar, and a political negotiator, and Catherine ticked every box. She also happened to be in love with someone else. At the time Henry proposed, Catherine had begun a quiet romance with Thomas Seymour, brother to Jane Seymour, wife 3, and a man of ambition, charm, and just enough recklessness to be interesting. But when the King of England asks for your hand in marriage, and you value things like your head and continued existence, you don't say no. So in 1543, Catherine Parr became Queen of England, and immediately began performing the least glamorous royal duties imaginable. She bandaged wounds, she coordinated Henry's medications, she read to him, she prayed with him, she managed the royal children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, earning praise for her compassion and diplomacy. In short, she became the world's most overqualified nursemaid with a crown. But don't mistake her for a passive caretaker. Catherine was a deeply intelligent and theologically curious woman, fluent in Latin and Greek, and an avid reader of the religious reformers sweeping across Europe. She wasn't just pouring wine, she was poring over Lutheran texts and writing her own. In fact, Catherine Parr became the first woman in England to publish a book under her own name in English. Her works, including Prayers or Meditations and Lamentation of a Sinner, were thoughtful, reformist-leaning reflections that placed her squarely in the camp of Protestant sympathizers. This was risky. Henry, despite breaking from Rome, had a weird on-again, off-again relationship with reform. He wasn't a Protestant. He just liked being the boss of his own church. So when his conservative advisors caught wind of Catherine's writings, they saw an opportunity. They accused her of heresy, whispering in Henry's ear that his queen was dabbling in dangerous theology and possibly leading the king toward damnation, or worse, backtalk. An arrest warrant was drawn up. Catherine, tipped off by friendly allies, did something brilliant. She beat them to the argument. She went straight to Henry and, get this, apologized for trying to debate him, saying she only did it to distract him from his pain and learn from his wisdom. Henry, flattered and bloated with self-importance, dropped the matter. A few days later, when the guards arrived with the warrant, he waved them away like a man casually cancelling an execution. Catherine had survived by doing what few had ever done, out-talking a king without triggering a beheading. And then, in 1547, the unthinkable happened. Henry passed away. Catherine didn't grieve like a woman who'd lost the love of her life. She grieved like a woman who'd just been released from a very tense hostage situation, and she wasted no time. Within months, she married Thomas Seymour, the man she'd loved before Henry entered the picture. It was fast, it was slightly scandalous, and it was doomed. Catherine became pregnant at 35, a rare and risky age in Tudor times. The pregnancy was physically brutal. She gave birth to a daughter in 1548, but died of puerperal fever just 6 days later. Her final year had been brief and bittersweet, a post-Henry epilogue that gave her a flash of personal happiness before life closed the curtain. But her legacy lived on. She had shaped the upbringing of Elizabeth I, influenced religious thought at court, and proven that a woman could survive Henry VIII without losing her head or her voice. In the grand theatre of Tudor tragedy, Catherine Parr wasn't just the final act. She was the only one who read the script, dodged the trapdoors, and made it to the credits with a mic drop. When people think of Henry VIII's love life, they often imagine a soap opera wrapped in ermine robes, a tangled mess of wives, mistresses, and heads that occasionally fell off. But beneath the romantic carnage was something far more profound, a seismic shift in English identity, politics, and religion. 6 marriages didn't just give England 6 queens, they gave it a completely new national soul. Henry's obsession with heirs, legacy, and getting his own way led to what is perhaps the most dramatic ecclesiastical breakup in Western history. When the Pope refused to grant an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, Henry didn't just throw a tantrum, he declared spiritual independence. It was like arguing with your landlord and deciding to tear down the entire building to build your own, with blackjack and bishops. Henry's dating life made England Protestant. Forget it's complicated. His relationship status was constitutionally explosive. Let's start with the break from the Catholic Church. In 1534, Henry passed the Act of Supremacy, which made him the supreme head of the Church of England, a title previously reserved for the Pope. It was a bold move for a man who still considered himself theologically conservative. Henry wasn't a Martin Luther-type reformer. He just wanted to remarry legally without Roman interference. But once the cord was cut, there was no going back. And with independence came restructuring. Henry's next target? The monasteries. Those vast, wealthy, land-holding institutions filled with monks who answered to Rome, not the king. In what can only be described as a hostile takeover, Henry launched the dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 to 1540. Around 800 monasteries, abbeys, and nunneries were dismantled, stripped of wealth and often reduced to rubble. It was a state-sponsored yard sale, and Henry was handing out the receipts. The crown seized incredible amounts of land and treasure, but Henry wasn't interested in building a mega prayer park. No, he did what any power-hungry monarch with bills and enemies would do. He sold the church lands to the nobility, cheap, fast, with barely a background check. This single act reshaped the English aristocracy. Families who had previously been minor landholders or political wallflowers suddenly found themselves wealthy, influential, and loyal to the new regime. It was a Tudor version of buy now, kneel later. In exchange for lands and titles, these nobles backed the king's religious transformation, whether they agreed with it or not. But here's the twist. Henry wasn't even fully Protestant. Yes, he'd torn down monasteries, seized church wealth, and kicked the Pope to the curb, but Henry remained deeply traditional in doctrine. The 6 Articles of 1539 reaffirmed conservative Catholic practices like clerical celibacy and transubstantiation, basically the theological equivalent of "I hate Rome but I still like their snacks." Protestant reformers were persecuted, and Henry flip-flopped between burning Catholics for disloyalty and Protestants for heresy. Nobody was safe. The king was like a one-man inquisition with mood swings, but the machinery he'd built, the Church of England, the empowered nobles, the loss of papal authority couldn't be undone. When Henry died in 1547, the kingdom was left with an identity crisis wrapped in a legal revolution. His boy king's successor, Edward VI, swung the pendulum hard toward Protestantism. His half-sister Mary I would later yank it back toward Rome in a blaze of Catholic vengeance, and then Elizabeth I would balance it somewhere in the middle, mostly because she was tired of everyone catching fire for disagreeing. And what drove it all? A king who wanted a son got a divorce and couldn't take no from the Vatican. In the end, Henry's domestic dramas became national doctrine. His personal desires, lust, ego, legacy triggered a domino effect of constitutional reform, religious division, and social upheaval. What began as a marriage problem ended in a century of spiritual war, cultural transformation, and real estate redistribution. Suddenly, priests were marrying, sermons were in English, and the Bible wasn't chained to a lectern anymore. The Word of God had gone portable, and the old authority, draped in incense and Latin, was replaced by a new one, dressed in royal decree and ambition. Perhaps the most fascinating part is how quickly it all happened. In less than 2 decades, England went from the Pope's loyal bulldog to a nation with its own church, its own doctrine, and its own flavor of spiritual nationalism, all thanks to one man's inability to tolerate strong-willed wives and weak male heirs. The fallout didn't just shift England's soul, it rewrote the DNA of the monarchy, the church, and the nobility. It set the stage for future civil wars, revolutions, and philosophical movements. Henry VIII died in 1547, bloated, paranoid, and let's be honest, probably weighing more than his throne could safely support. But the damage, or transformation depending on your perspective, had already been done. His body gave out, but the national identity crisis he created was only just getting started. Henry didn't just leave behind 3 children. He left behind 3 wildly different visions, a deeply confused religious system, and more unresolved trauma than a Tudor family therapist could possibly unpack. The royal succession, once supposed to be a smooth chain of male heirs, had become a roller coaster of fire, faith, and familial awkwardness. Henry VIII didn't just leave behind a bunch of wives, he left a national identity crisis and a family tree that needed therapy. First up was Edward VI, the long-awaited golden boy from wife 3, Jane Seymour. Crowned at just 9 years old, Edward inherited both the throne and the enormous pressure to continue Henry's not quite Catholic, not quite Protestant vision. But Edward had his own ideas, or rather, his advisors did. During his 6-year reign before dying of illness at 15, England lurched fully into Protestantism. Churches were stripped of icons, Latin was swapped for English, and the clergy were suddenly allowed to marry. Henry might have launched the Church of England, but Edward's reign wrote the user manual. Unfortunately, Edward also wrote a last-minute will that excluded his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession, because nothing says stable monarchy like ignoring Parliament and scribbling over inheritance law like a teenager forging a report card. Cue chaos. Edward's pick for successor was Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant cousin who reigned for 9 days before being unceremoniously dethroned by the far more popular and far more Catholic Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Mary didn't just take the throne, she dragged England back toward Rome by its ears. Mary's reign, 1553-1558, was, to put it gently, intense. She reversed Edward's Protestant reforms, restored papal authority, and married Philip II of Spain, a Catholic powerhouse whose idea of diplomacy was usually followed by the Spanish Inquisition. But Mary's real legacy? Her attempt to restore Catholicism with the subtle touch of a blowtorch. Over 280 Protestants were burned at the stake for heresy, including former Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer. The fires of Smithfield turned public squares into execution sites, and public opinion soured faster than a Tudor meat pie. That's how she earned the nickname Bloody Mary, not from cocktails, but from her very enthusiastic bonfire season. Mary died in 1558, childless and despised by half the country, and her half-sister Elizabeth I stepped up reluctantly, but gloriously. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn and political survival incarnate, had spent her youth dodging suspicion, imprisonment, and probably several assassination plots. When she became queen, England let out a collective, nervous sigh. Would she be Protestant, Catholic? Would heads roll? Would anyone not end up in prison this time? Her answer was the Elizabethan religious settlement, a moderate, don't-scare-the-horses version of Protestantism. It kept the Church of England independent but retained just enough ceremonial flair to avoid open rebellion. It was like a theological mullet, Protestant in front, Catholic in the back. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, guiding England into what we now call the Golden Age, an era of flourishing art, exploration, and not-so-secret piracy dressed up as naval expansion. She remained unmarried, earning the title Virgin Queen, and played continental suitors like a game of diplomatic Jenga. Most importantly, she stabilized the nation, balancing tradition and reform, power and populism. But even after Elizabeth, Henry's legacy didn't vanish. It simply embedded itself into the DNA of the monarchy. His break from Rome created a nation that forever saw religion and politics as deeply entangled, for better or worse. Every future monarch had to grapple with the Church of England, religious factionalism, and that ever-persistent question, are we Protestant enough yet? Henry's redistribution of monastic lands reshaped the economic structure of the nobility, enriching families who would dominate parliament and politics for generations. His legal tinkering with succession laid the groundwork for constitutional monarchism, where kings and queens had to listen to more than just their own egos, in theory anyway. Culturally, Henry turned the throne into a stage, with marriage as spectacle and governance as theatre. His court was the original reality show, complete with betrayal, costume changes, and periodic beheadings to keep ratings high. And emotionally, well, England had inherited one of the most dysfunctional royal family legacies imaginable. A country once united under shared Catholic identity was now a divided realm, bouncing between doctrine and doubt, struggling to define itself in a world where the king's libido could redraw the map. Yet somehow, through all the flames, factions and fainting courtiers, England emerged more centralized, more modern, and more powerful than when Henry had found it. His reign was brutal, chaotic, and often ludicrous, but it pushed England out of the medieval fog and into the early modern spotlight. Not bad for a guy who just wanted a male heir and a bit less nagging at dinner. Let's begin at the very dawn of human existence, a time before smartphones, before plumbing, before the concept of please knock. We're talking about a world where pants hadn't been invented, modesty was a social experiment yet to begin, and toilet paper was, well, anything that didn't bite back. Welcome to prehistoric bathroom habits, or more accurately, the complete absence of them. The average early human didn't go to the bathroom. They simply went, wherever they pleased, or more accurately, wherever didn't involve getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger mid-squat. Bathroom breaks weren't a private affair. They were a group activity. Archaeologists have discovered signs of communal defecation areas in prehistoric settlements, open patches of land where people collectively dropped their dignity alongside other things. Imagine trying to focus on your business while your neighbor grunts 3 feet away, making unsettling eye contact. This wasn't a private stall situation. It was a festival of functions. And no, there were no warning signs or polite knocks. If you were squatting and someone walked by, congratulations, you've got company. When it came to wiping, prehistoric humans had options, none of them good. Rocks, moss, sticks, animal fur or leaves if you were lucky, and if you were unlucky, poisonous leaves. Hello, instant regret. Softness was not a priority, survival was, and survival didn't care about your chaponnerie. There is even some evidence to suggest that shells and smooth bones may have been used as rudimentary wiping tools. That's right. Prehistoric charmin was whatever you could find on the forest floor that wasn't too pointy. And let's not forget, no one was washing their hands afterward. Soap wouldn't be invented for thousands of years, and the idea of hygiene was still curled up in the fetal position somewhere in the distant future. Forget flushing. There was nothing to flush with. Waste was left where it landed, or buried with a stick, if someone was feeling particularly fancy. But more often than not, people would just move their camp if things got too ripe. And the smells? Let's just say the air was rich with earthy undertones and a bold bouquet of unfiltered humanity. You didn't escape the smell, you lived in it. It was your reality, your perfume, your aura. Diseases like parasites, dysentery, and other gastrointestinal gifts were passed around like birthday cards, except instead of happy birthday it was more like, enjoy 2 weeks of violent regret. But did early humans care? Probably not. When you're busy dodging mammoths and making fire for the first time, personal freshness drops low on the to-do list. Biomechanically speaking, the squat was actually a very effective posture. It straightened the colon, provided optimal force leverage, and was probably the one thing early humans accidentally did right in terms of health. Of course, they didn't have squatty potties or ergonomic supports. If the ground was muddy, rocky, or just poorly timed during a thunderstorm, congrats. You are now intimately connected to Mother Earth, both spiritually and physically. Balance was key. One wrong shift in weight and you'd either land in yesterday's dinner or today's disaster. The risks were high and the dignity was low. The concept of privacy didn't exist. If you needed to go, you went. And if the entire tribe saw you, they just added that to the list of things no one had time to be embarrassed about. Being embarrassed wasn't evolutionarily beneficial. You couldn't be shy when nature called because nature was also full of things that wanted to eat you. You were always on the clock. You had 30 seconds to drop, do and dash. Think of it this way. If you were trying to poop in peace and a rustle came from the bushes, that wasn't your imagination. It was something large, carnivorous, and deeply uninterested in letting you finish. So, in a very real sense, prehistoric humans were the original speed poopers. Not because they wanted to be, but because lingering could be fatal. So, to sum it up, prehistoric people didn't have toilets. They didn't have privacy. They didn't have soap, plumbing, walls, or even decency by today's standards. What they did have was a deep connection to the land, and not always in the poetic sense. Your daily bathroom break was an obstacle course of environmental hazards, biting insects, unwashed hands, and questionable leaves. But hey, at least you didn't have to wait in line. In the great timeline of human innovation, toilets were still just a twinkle in the eye of a distant genius. For now, it was just you, the wilderness, and your tribe watching as you squatted into the winds of fate. By the time humanity graduated from hunting mammoths to building pyramids, the ancient Egyptians had made some major strides in the art of existence. They figured out agriculture, astronomy, embalming, and eyeliner that could withstand a sandstorm. But when it came to toilets, well, let's just say things were still in the trial and error phase. Sanitation was no longer just a tribal afterthought. It was now an exercise in early engineering, class division, and the eternal hope that your rear end wouldn't get sunburned on a limestone slab. The ancient Egyptians had a bit of a fixation with cleanliness. They bathed regularly, shaved their bodies, and anointed themselves with sweet-smelling oils to keep demons and probably body odor at bay. But despite their obsession with ritual purity, their toilet game left something to be desired, especially if you weren't rolling in gold. For the elite, toilet luxury meant having a dedicated spot inside the home, a niche carved into a corner where a limestone toilet seat sat atop a sand-filled ceramic pot. Sounds civilized, right? Sure, until you remember this was happening in the blistering Egyptian heat. Imagine plopping down for your royal release only to discover your throne had been basking in 100 VF sun all morning. It's not a bidet, it's a branding. To deal with waste, these pots would be manually emptied, often into nearby fields or open ditches, where the cycle of nature's fertilizer took on a very literal and very smelly form. Sanitation workers, yes, there were some, were charged with transporting human waste away from homes and temples. You might think of them as the early version of modern sewer engineers, except with less plumbing and more buckets. Now, for the vast majority of Egyptians, the farmers, labourers and pyramid-hauling common folk, there were no sun-kissed stone seats. Their bathrooms were the open fields, the edge of the village, or a pit dug in haste. In rural households, makeshift wooden stools with holes carved in the middle were sometimes used, placed over a simple clay pot. It was as basic got. No papyrus-scented candles, no gold trim, just you, gravity and a bucket. Speaking of papyrus, historians believe that softened papyrus may have occasionally served as a wiping tool. But before you sigh with relief and imagine it like ancient two-ply, remember, papyrus is a plant, and plants are only soft when compared to, say, rocks. If you had the luxury of using it, you were probably a scribe or a noble, someone who could afford to defile their writing material. Otherwise, you were back to leaves, sand, or nothing at all. Ancient butts were a tougher breed. What makes it all even more paradoxical is that this was the same civilization that spent weeks preparing a body for burial, scrubbing it with natron salts, wrapping it in layer upon layer of linen, and sealing it in a sarcophagus guarded by curses. But daily bathroom use? Still just grab a jar and hope for the best. It's as if they poured all their design effort into the afterlife and forgot to make the living bit a little more comfortable. We also can't ignore the environmental factor, the Nile. This river was the beating heart of Egypt, and it also became a very convenient, if wildly unsanitary, place for waste disposal. There are records suggesting that waste would often be dumped into the river, which the Egyptians also used for drinking, bathing, fishing, and pretty much every part of life. It was the ultimate multitasker, pulling double duty as sacred water source and accidental sewer. And then there's the temple aspect. Egyptian religion played a role in nearly everything, from the positioning of your house to how you wiped your behind. Priests were expected to maintain extremely high standards of purity. They shaved their entire bodies daily and bathed multiple times. And while there's no record of a priestly toilet inspection committee, you can bet they weren't squatting behind a bush like commoners. In temple complexes there were likely designated privy areas, but these were far from the technological marvels we might imagine. If anything, the holier you were, the more awkward your bathroom rituals probably became. Yet despite the lack of modern plumbing, the Egyptians were already toying with the idea of a private toilet space, even if it was nothing more than a hot slab above a bowl. They recognized the need to remove waste from living spaces, understood the link between cleanliness and health, even if they attributed it to spiritual rather than bacterial causes, and most importantly, had the beginnings of waste management. Not bad for a civilization that also believed dung beetles rolled the sun across the sky. And let's face it, they deserve some credit. While their neighbors might have been squatting in total exposure, the Egyptians tried to give waste its rightful place in a pot, in a corner, and hopefully not in full view of Aunt Nefertari during dinner. They may have mummified their kings and drawn constellations on tomb ceilings, but when it came to toilets, they were still very much experimenting. The next big leap wouldn't come until the Romans got involved, and they brought sponges, communal seating, and absolutely no shame. So if you thought limestone toilet seats were wild, just wait until you hear about tersoriums. When in Rome, do as the Romans do, which unfortunately means you'll be pooping in a row of holes while making awkward eye contact with the guy next to you, 'cause in the glorious world of ancient Rome, toilets were communal. Hygiene was a group project, and the phrase public service took on a whole new meaning. Let's start with the infrastructure. Because the Romans were nothing if not engineers, they were masters of aqueducts, sewer systems, and city planning, and they applied all that knowledge to their toilets. Kind of. Enter the latrina, the Roman version of a public restroom, only without doors, stalls, or shame. These were long stone benches, sometimes marble if you were fancy, with evenly spaced holes cut out over a flowing drainage channel. You sat, you did your business, and the waste washed away beneath you. It was the height of convenience. If your idea of convenience involves squatting cheek to cheek with strangers like you're part of a very unfortunate chorus line. There were no partitions, no privacy walls, not even the dignity of a half-hearted curtain. In fact, socializing while on the toilet was not just common, it was practically expected. Romans saw the latrina as an extension of public life. You could discuss philosophy, catch up on politics, or even negotiate a business deal while unloading last night's banquet. Picture this: senators discussing tax reforms while their togas are hiked up and their backsides are aligned over an ancient sewage trough. Nothing says civic engagement quite like casual constipation among colleagues, but the pièce de résistance of Roman toilet culture, the tersorium. This charming little tool was essentially a sponge attached to a stick, used for wiping. Each public latrine had a few of them lying around because what's more communal than sharing your hygiene equipment? After use, the tersorium would be rinsed in a bucket of water, often mixed with salt, vinegar, Or maybe some other ingredient someone swore had disinfectant properties, like hope. Then it was placed back in rotation, ready for the next unsuspecting visitor. Let's be clear, this was not a bring-your-own-sponge system. No, this was a shared utensil, like a group toothbrush for your behind. Modern scholars have politely called this communal sanitation, but let's not sugarcoat it. You wiped with something that had already made multiple rear-end cameos that day, and then you smiled and made conversation. Now, to be fair, the tersorium did serve a functional purpose. It was gentler than scraping with pottery shards or leaves popular elsewhere, and the vinegar solution may have helped kill some bacteria. But even by ancient standards, this wasn't exactly hygienic. Diseases spread easily, especially parasites, and people got sick. But for Romans, the convenience outweighed the consequences. Besides, they believed that bathing several times a week in a communal bathhouse was enough to cleanse both body and soul, even if your toilet tool had just been on a pan-Mediterranean tour of local colons. For the upper class, though, things got slightly more luxurious. Wealthy Romans could afford private toilets in their homes, often small cubicles tucked into the corners of villas. These were connected to the same sewer systems as the public latrines, with waste whisked away by gravity and flowing water. And while they didn't have golden toilet seats or aromatherapy candles, they did at least have a break from the constant eye contact. Interestingly, the Romans took waste seriously in a civic sense. Their massive sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, was one of the earliest examples of organized urban sanitation. It helped drain the marshlands, funnel rainwater, and yes, flush the city's collective bowels. And it worked. For all the awkwardness of their toilet arrangements, Rome stayed surprisingly clean, especially compared to future centuries where people went back to tossing chamber pots out windows and praying for the best. What's more, toilets were often decorated. Some latrines had mosaics, graffiti, or witty inscriptions above the seats. You might find a fresco of a god watching over your process, or a helpful bit of advice, cave carnum, beware of dog, which might be a metaphor or not. There's even archaeological evidence of toilet gods, like the charmingly named Steracousius, a deity associated with manure. Yes, the Romans had a literal god of poop, worshipped him, built shrines, made offerings. Because when everything's public, even your digestive habits get a divine patron. So let's review. You're in a stone building. It's crowded. You sit down on a cold marble bench, pull up your toga, nod politely to the person 2 holes over, and reach for a vinegar-soaked sponge on a stick that's been shared by at least 5 strangers and 1 guy with questionable personal choices. You chat about gladiators, grain prices, and the Senate's latest mess while contributing one of your own. And when you're done, you rinse and repeat, literally. And that, friends, was civilization. Sure, it wasn't private, it wasn't sterile, but the Romans had created something no other society before them had dared, a fully functional city-wide sanitation system that you could talk in. It was weird, it was brilliant, and it was just the beginning. The Middle Ages, a time of knights in shining armor, damsels in distress, and a bathroom situation that could best be described as catastrophically airborne. Sure, the castles were majestic, the feasts were hearty, and the plagues were plentiful. But if you think royalty meant luxury, just remember your toilet was a hole in a wall, and your business had a habit of splattering the courtyard below. Welcome to medieval sanitation, where gravity was the only plumbing, and the only flushing sound came from terrified servants diving for cover. Let's begin with the guardrobe, a charming euphemism for a toilet that was really just a box with a hole protruding from the side of a castle wall. These were usually tucked into corners or towers, often built into the thick outer walls, and positioned directly above moats, rivers, or if you were unlucky, solid stone. The idea was simple: do your business, and let physics handle the rest. And to be fair, it did work. Waste would drop out the bottom and ideally disappear from sight, smell, and thought. Unless, of course, it didn't. In many cases, the waste just accumulated in piles below, slowly fermenting into what historians might generously call defensive landscaping. Any enemy trying to scale your walls would get a bonus sensory assault. Siege warfare was bad enough without being pelted by yesterday's stew. Inside, the guardrobes were often lined with wood and sometimes had a little curtain for the illusion of privacy. But that was about as luxurious as it got. There was no water system, no trap to stop the smell from coming back up, and definitely no seat warmer. Instead, many guardrobes doubled as clothes closets. Yes, really, since people believed the ammonia from the waste would help kill lice. That's right, your favorite tunic was hanging above a medieval porta potty, gently absorbing the ambience. But what if you weren't in a castle? What if you were a merchant, a servant, or a particularly unlucky peasant in a bustling medieval town? Enter the chamber pot, a small bucket, bowl or jug that lived under your bed or in the corner of your one-room home. When nature called, you'd squat, aim and hope for the best. Then, when the pot was full, you'd do what any sensible person would do, toss it out the window. To be clear, this wasn't done silently. The polite thing to do was shout "Gardez-loo" before dumping your medieval cocktail onto the street. It comes from the French "regardez-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. Although to be fair, it was rarely just water. Passers-by learned to hug the walls of buildings and keep one eye on the upper stories at all times. A walk through the city wasn't just a stroll, it was a full-contact sport. Streets in cities like London, Paris and Edinburgh became slick, smelly rivers of filth. There were no organized sewer systems, just open gutters, and the hope that rain would wash things away eventually. Add in rotting food, dead animals and livestock wandering around, and you've got a recipe for disease that would make a modern health inspector weep into their clipboard. Now someone had to clean all this up, and that someone was known as the Gong farmer, a man whose job was to dig out the cesspits beneath privies and haul away the accumulated waste. Gong was slang for dung, and farmer was apparently the nicest title they could come up with for someone who spent their nights knee-deep in other people's leftovers. Gong farmers worked in the dark, under the streets, scraping sludge from pit latrines and transporting it to the outskirts of town. It was a job so foul that they were only allowed to work at night, partly to avoid offending the general public, and partly because the smell was said to linger like a ghost with unfinished business. The stench was legendary. Many Gong farmers had their own clothes, their own tools, and hopefully their own friends who didn't mind that they smelled like a sewer had gained sentience. Surprisingly, it wasn't always a badly paid job. Cities needed these men, and some earned decent wages, but social status? Non-existent? You could be the richest man in town and still be seated far, far away from the guy who literally handled your waste. Even monasteries weren't spared. Monks had communal privies, long wooden planks with multiple holes built over trenches or pits. And since silence was part of monastic life, imagine a line of monks doing their business in perfect solemn stillness, save for the occasional splash. As for toilet paper, don't get your hopes up. Most people wiped with straw, moss, rags, or whatever the cat hadn't already claimed as a bed. Some used old cloth if they could afford it, but that cloth had to be washed and reused, which means someone, somewhere, had to do laundry with the knowledge that the towels had seen some things. The worst part? For all the royal grandeur, even kings and queens couldn't escape the lack of plumbing. The throne was a literal chair with a hole in it, placed over a chamber pot or garderobe, so yes, you might be wearing a crown, but you were still one wrong step from plunging your royal dignity into the abyss. The good news? You lived in a castle. The bad news? So did your poop, and it liked to travel by air. While medieval Europe was busy launching airborne chamber pots and developing an immune system the hard way, much of Asia had already entered what could only be described as the golden age of going number 2. From clever engineering to cultural cleanliness, civilizations across the East were pioneering bathroom brilliance while the West was still treating wiping as an optional boss fight. Let's begin in ancient China, where the approach to sanitation was surprisingly forward-thinking. By the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, the Chinese had already developed toilets with wooden seats, placed above deep pits, essentially early versions of outhouses but with an extra layer of user comfort. Unlike their European counterparts who thought a hole in the castle wall was enough innovation for a century, the Chinese realized that if you're going to sit, you might as well make it slightly pleasant. But the true pièce de résistance, pig-powered sewage systems. Yes, you read that right. Some households, particularly in the countryside, used pig toilets, where human waste dropped directly into a pen underneath the toilet. The pigs, being the undiscerning omnivores they are, would handle the recycling. This system was as horrifying as it was efficient. Waste disposal? Check. Free pig feed? Double check. Appetite? Cancelled. To be clear, these systems were typically used in rural, poorer households, and not everyone was thrilled with the arrangement. Still, it's hard not to admire the sheer practicality of it all. Say what you will about pig toilets, but at least no one was shouting, "Look out below," before launching poop out a window. Fast forward several centuries and cross over to Japan, and the innovation jumps from clever to downright futuristic. Even in ancient times, Japan favored squat toilets, which are more hygienic and biomechanically healthy than their Western-seated cousins. Public bathhouses and toilets were common in urban areas by the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, and cleanliness was deeply embedded in the culture, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. And then, somewhere between samurai duels and origami cranes, Japan decided that using the bathroom should be an experience. In the modern era, they invented the washlet, a smart toilet equipped with a bidet function, heated seats, air dryers, ambient sounds, and even mood lighting. It's not just a toilet, it's a spa for your behind. Some models will open the lid automatically when you approach, flush when you stand up, and politely pretend it didn't just witness what you did. And while that might sound futuristic, the roots of Japanese toilet culture are ancient. The Shinto belief system emphasizes purification and cleanliness. Bathing, washing, and yes, proper post-poop care are spiritual acts as well as physical ones. Even in early Japanese latrines, there was a conscious effort to keep the space clean and separate from living areas, a concept that took Europe several more centuries and a few pandemics to grasp. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, hygiene wasn't just a good idea, it was a religious obligation. Islam places significant emphasis on cleanliness, both spiritual and physical. That translated into early sewage systems, running water in some urban centers, and ritual cleansing practices that made most other civilizations look like they were still playing in the dirt. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo had organized systems for managing waste and water supply as early as the 8th and 9th centuries. Many homes had internal courtyards with private latrines, and the waste was often channeled into public drainage systems or removed manually by workers. Not ideal, but certainly more advanced than Europe's just dump it in the street strategy. And let's not forget, the Islamic world also gave us soap, actual soap, made with lye and fat, in use for both bathing and cleaning. Europeans wouldn't embrace widespread soap usage until centuries later, long after they'd perfected the fine art of perfuming over problems. What truly stands out across much of Asia and the Islamic world is the philosophical attitude toward hygiene. While other civilizations treated bathroom needs as a dirty secret or a necessary evil, many Eastern societies saw it as a matter of health, ritual, and respect. Cleanliness was part of a good life, not just a nice bonus. The result? Toilet systems that were, for the time, far more advanced, efficient, and socially integrated. Compare that to the medieval West, where sanitation involved yelling a warning before flinging your waste and hoping no one important got splashed. It's the difference between using science to build a toilet and using luck to survive one. So while Europe played poop dodgeball, Asia was out here inventing butt science. They understood that good hygiene wasn't just about feeling fresh. It was about public health, dignity, and not accidentally wiping with a medieval leaf of doom, and they were centuries ahead of the curve. If the Tudor era conjures images of glittering gowns, royal intrigue, and Henry VIII angrily swapping out wives like old socks, you're not wrong. But what those historical portraits fail to show is the stench, because behind every Tudor court drama was the unmistakable aroma of a world that hadn't quite worked out plumbing or shame. Sanitation during this time was a strange brew of primitive technology, public exposure, and a surprising number of people whose entire career revolved around someone else's rear end. Let's start at the top, literally the top of the hierarchy. King Henry VIII, monarch of England, founder of the Church of England, and part-time toilet enthusiast, had an official courtier known as the Groom of the Stool. That's not a joke, nor is it a misunderstood title for an upholstery expert. This was a man whose full-time job was to assist the king with his bathroom needs, including wiping his royal bottom. Now, before you gasp and assume this was a position of humiliation, think again. The Groom of the Stool was actually one of the most powerful and trusted members of the royal household. He was close to the king, very close, and privy, pun intended, to state secrets, personal thoughts, and yes, physical waste. This gentleman didn't just wipe the monarch's posterior. He managed access to the king, controlled private correspondence, and even handled financial accounts. It was essentially the Tudor version of a chief of staff, with significantly more linen. Of course, not everyone in Tudor England had their own personal butt valet. The rest of the population had to rely on far humbler setups. Privies, or outdoor toilets, were usually small wooden structures built over pits. No plumbing, no running water, and no dignity if your neighbor decided to walk by at the wrong moment. Some were shared among multiple households, creating the sort of communal experience that no one really asked for. Others were more private, but private in this case still meant cold, dark, and bug-infested. When the pit beneath a privy filled up, it had to be emptied manually. There were no underground sewage systems in Tudor towns, just people with shovels and strong stomachs. Waste would often be dumped into cesspools, carted away to the countryside, or in many cases, simply tossed into open sewers that ran through city streets. These sewers were essentially shallow trenches, sometimes covered, often not, that collected everything from human waste to dead animals to kitchen scraps. They were less sanitation systems and more festering trails of disease winding their way through urban life. This led to a rather ironic situation. Tudor society was obsessed with smell, believing that foul odors themselves caused illness. The miasma theory held that bad air made you sick, so people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried scented pomanders, and doused themselves in rosewater. And yet, many of these same people were defecating into buckets and dumping the contents into the street. The hypocrisy had a perfume, and it wasn't Chanel. Back inside the home, chamber pots were still the reigning solution for nighttime needs. Made of ceramic, pewter, or even silver for the wealthy, these were kept under beds or in corners and emptied, hopefully by morning. In larger households, a servant handled this duty. In smaller ones, it was a DIY situation. But wherever you lived, the goal was simple: keep it out of sight until it became too full to ignore. And Tudor cities? They weren't built with sanitation in mind. Streets were narrow, drainage was poor, and rainfall just redistributed the mess. During hot summers, the air became thick with the bouquet of fermentation. London in particular developed a reputation for its overwhelming stench, a potent mix of sweat, dung, and despair. Visitors from abroad often commented on it, and not in a charming local custom kind of way. Even public facilities were rudimentary. Some taverns and inns had shared latrines in the back, often nothing more than a plank over a pit. Theatres like Shakespeare's Globe had no proper toilets, meaning that during a 3-hour performance of Hamlet, audience members might slip out behind the building to relieve themselves in alleys or corners. It was the original intermission panic. Yet despite all this, people somehow managed. The Tudor world kept turning, carried on the shoulders of underpaid servants and the tireless efforts of those tasked with emptying buckets of human waste. And while many may have dreamed of more elegant ways to relieve themselves, technological progress was slow, and the social norms around sanitation even slower. The most fascinating part? All this was accepted as normal. You might balk at the thought of someone wiping a monarch's bottom by candlelight, but to the Tudors, it was just Tuesday. Sanitation was a matter of function, not comfort, and the idea of a private, flushable toilet was still a few centuries and many cholera outbreaks away. So imagine your job is to wipe the royal cheeks. The benefits: proximity to power. The downside: also proximity to power. But things wouldn't stay this smelly forever. As the centuries rolled on, so did innovation. And soon the world would see the rise of toilet chairs disguised as furniture, plumbing that still didn't quite work, and a general Victorian belief that roses could mask anything. The Victorians prided themselves on being proper. Politeness, modesty, and tightly laced corsets ruled the day. They covered piano legs for being too suggestive, fainted if a tablecloth wasn't the right length, and called chickens limbless birds at dinner, just to avoid saying thigh. But when it came to toilets, oh, they lost their collective minds. You might think they'd go the route of refinement and functionality. Instead, they went with wooden chairs that held your poop, and a national tradition of suffering in silence while their parlours slowly filled with the smell of disaster. Let's start with the camouflage commode, a marvel of Victorian engineering that combined the worst parts of furniture and plumbing into one highly deceptive package. These were ordinary-looking chairs, mahogany perhaps, with intricate carvings and plush upholstery, that, upon closer inspection, were actually toilets. Lift the seat cushion and voila, a ceramic or metal pot waiting patiently underneath, like a porcelain demon hiding in grandma's favourite armchair. These close stools or night commodes weren't limited to bedrooms either. Oh no, some proud households kept them in drawing rooms for convenience. That's right, imagine you're sipping tea, listening to your host discuss the moral downfall of society, and all the while you're seated next to a chair that is actively holding waste. And no one's talking about it, because this is Victorian England, and acknowledging bodily functions is so uncivilized. But this wasn't just a quirky interior design choice. It was also a symptom of a very real sanitation crisis. London and other industrial cities were booming, and with that boom came millions of people, all of them producing waste at an alarming, thoroughly human rate. Many homes still relied on chamber pots and outhouses, and indoor plumbing was a luxury, not a standard. So while the Victorians had railroads, gas lamps and serialized novels, most of them were still pooping into pots and dumping them in the street. The situation reached a climax, literally and olfactorily, in 1858, during an event so spectacularly disgusting that history has immortalized it as the Great Stink. That summer, London was hit with a brutal heat wave, and the River Thames, already a glorified sewer, turned into a bubbling cauldron of filth. The smell was so powerful that members of Parliament couldn't sit in session without pressing handkerchiefs soaked in perfume to their faces. Curtains were doused in chloride of lime. Lawmakers debated from behind hastily nailed-up sheets, as if the stench were a vampire that feared cotton. The city panicked. Public health was in shambles. Cholera outbreaks were frequent, and for good reason. People were drinking water that practically came with its own biohazard warning. It was clear something had to be done. Enter Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the civil engineer who designed a massive new sewer system to carry waste out of the city. Finally, the Victorians had a solution that didn't involve apologizing to dinner guests for the smell coming from under the piano stool. But even before Bazalgette laid his first pipe, there had been attempts, some noble, some absurd, to improve the toilet. One such innovator was Sir John Harrington, a godson of Queen Elizabeth I, who had invented a prototype flush toilet back in the 16th century. It didn't catch on then, probably because nobody was ready for water to leave the room without being hurled out a window first, but his design would later inspire the next generation. Enter Thomas Crapper. Yes, that's his real name. A plumber and entrepreneur who popularized the modern flush toilet during the 19th century. Contrary to popular myth, he didn't invent the toilet, but he did make it cool. His company promoted and sold sanitary porcelain toilets to the Victorian middle and upper class, finally making indoor plumbing a respectable and somewhat less smelly aspiration. But despite these advances, many Victorians remained deeply uncomfortable with the idea of toilets. They wanted convenience, yes, but they also wanted denial. That's why toilet furniture came with elegant coverings, elaborate designs, and sometimes even fake drawers to hide their real purpose. It was like building a rocket ship and painting it to look like a picnic basket, technically advanced but deeply insecure about it. To mask the unavoidable smell, households turned to chamber room scents, lavender sachets, potpourri bowls, floral sprays and vinegar solutions were placed liberally throughout the house. Some even kept burning incense or charcoal near the commode to neutralize odors. The logic was simple. If it smells like roses, it must be sanitary, right? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Even Queen Victoria, ruler of an empire so vast the sun never set on it, couldn't escape the reality of the era's toilet troubles. Her palaces had private lavatories installed, but even these were often flushed manually and drained into nearby cesspits or rudimentary pipes, and God help you if you were visiting and didn't know which fancy chair was actually a biohazard with upholstery. So yes, the Victorians were polite about everything except the gurgling horror emanating from their decorative poop chairs. They could discuss morality, industrialization and Shakespeare with great civility, but don't you dare ask what's inside the ottoman. After centuries of squatting over pits, sitting on steaming stone slabs and sharing sponge sticks with strangers, seriously, Romans, why? Humanity finally flushed its way into the modern age. The 20th century wasn't just about wars, moon landings and microwavable meals. It was also the Great Toilet Revolution. And oh, what a glorious porcelain-tiled victory it was. The game changer? Indoor plumbing. By the early 1900s, the concept of having a toilet inside your home, not out in the cold, spider-infested outhouse, not dangling over a medieval moat, was becoming a reality for the middle class. What was once a luxury of the elite became a basic expectation, and by the mid-20th century, it was hard to imagine life without the humble flush. These modern toilets weren't just convenient, they were private, a concept that previous centuries had apparently filed under luxuries we can't afford. Finally, you could handle your business without a pig watching, a neighbor shouting warnings or a chambermaid politely pretending not to hear the splash. No eye contact, no vinegar-soaked sponges, just you, four walls, and the sweet sound of flushing. But as toilets became standard, the quirks started emerging, because apparently, now that everyone had one, everyone had an opinion. In Asia, particularly in Japan, toilets quickly went from functional to technological marvel. The Japanese washlet became the Rolls-Royce of bathroom experience, offering heated seats, automatic lids, built-in bidets, blow dryers, and in some cases ambient bird sounds to preserve your dignity. Want your toilet to greet you when you enter the room? Done. Need a nightlight embedded in the bowl? Covered. Fancy a remote control with 38 buttons, most of which you'll never understand? Japan's got you. These thrones are so advanced they practically need a pilot's license. Some can analyze your health, track your habits, and play your favorite tunes while you go. There's a genuine possibility that Japanese toilets know you better than your spouse. Meanwhile, Europeans leaned hard into the bidet lifestyle, a system that, while often misunderstood by other parts of the world, is really just a plumbing-powered hug for your butt. Bidets became especially popular in France and Italy, where washing was preferred over wiping, and bathroom etiquette reached soap opera levels of refinement. In many places, it's unthinkable to do the deed without a follow-up splash session. Contrast that with the United States, which famously doubled down on toilet paper. Americans took their TP so seriously that during the 2020 pandemic it practically became currency. Bidets? Too foreign. Wet wipes? Maybe for babies. Jazz-playing Japanese smart toilets? I'll pass, thanks, but I'll take 18 rolls of ultra-soft double-ply tree pulp instead. In Australia, where toilets had to share space with poisonous spiders, the innovation went eco-friendly. The Aussies led the charge with dual-flush toilets, giving users the option of a lighter flush for liquid business and a stronger one for solid. It was a win for the environment, and a polite way to say, we trust you to know what you've done. But the true mark of toilet evolution is how far we've taken bathroom luxury. Once a space for pure necessity, the modern bathroom has become a spa. a sanctuary, and in some cases, a high-tech command center. There are toilets now with sensors that check if the seat is occupied before flushing, toilets that self-clean with UV lights, toilets that talk to you, which, depending on your level of caffeine and self-esteem, is either delightful or a little too intimate. On private jets and in luxury hotels, you'll find toilets so advanced they could launch a satellite if they wanted to. And in Silicon Valley, there's a smart toilet prototype that can analyze your waste for medical data, turning every trip into a mini health checkup. The toilet isn't just watching, it's judging, politely, in binary. Culturally, we've reached a bizarre level of personalization. Want your toilet seat to be exactly 37.2 D3? There's an app for that. Need your flush to sound like a waterfall to hide your own natural symphony? That too. We've gone from sticks and sand to Bluetooth bidets that play jazz. And still, despite all the tech, the core human ritual hasn't changed. It's still about finding a quiet place to sit, reflect, and politely ignore that you're performing the most universal act imaginable. But now, you can do it with back support, a warm seat, and possibly a Wi-Fi connection. The journey from open trenches and shouted warnings to whisper-quiet, automatic toilets has been long and messy. But here we are, sitting in victory, clean, comfortable, and occasionally startled by a lid that opens itself like a futuristic butler. Let's say you've trained for years, passed brutal physical tests, studied astrophysics, and finally made it aboard the International Space Station. You're floating 250 miles above Earth, surrounded by cutting-edge technology, breathtaking views, and zero gravity. The Earth spins beneath you. Your crewmates are brilliant. Humanity's dreams are literally riding on your shoulders. And then, inevitably, you have to poop. Welcome to the final frontier of flush, a place where relieving yourself isn't just a basic biological need, it's a $23 million engineering challenge. On Earth, toilets rely on one beautiful, underappreciated force, gravity. You do your business, pull a lever, and gravity does the rest. In space, there is no rest. In microgravity, your poop doesn't go down, it goes wherever it wants, which means without a carefully designed system, your humble Noma 2 could become a free-floating hazard, bouncing around the cabin like the world's worst game of Pong. The early days of spaceflight were, let's just say, less elegant. During the Apollo missions, astronauts used plastic bags with adhesive rings that they had to press, quite literally, to their backside. They'd go in the bag, then seal it up and knead in a germ-killing agent. That's right, bag it, seal it, and massage it like a cursed bread loaf. Oh, and the bags had no suction, which meant you had to be very accurate. One wrong move and Houston had a problem, a very brown floating problem. As for peeing, things were a little easier. Men had tubes with funnels connected to suction devices that pulled the urine away. Women unfortunately had to make do with far less ergonomic solutions. NASA didn't even design a female-friendly space toilet until decades into human spaceflight, because apparently rocket science was easier than building a gender-inclusive urinal. But things improved eventually. Enter the International Space Station's $23 million toilet, or as engineers like to call it, the Universal Waste Management System UWMS. It's not just a toilet, it's a gravity-simulating, suction-powered, foot-strapped, thigh-clamped masterpiece. Every flush is a ballet of physics, air pressure, and hope. Here's how it works. For peeing, astronauts use a hose with a funnel, specially shaped to prevent splashback in a weightless environment. For pooping, they sit on a small seat and strap themselves in using thigh restraints and foot loops to prevent accidental mid-flight liftoff. The toilet creates airflow that pulls the waste away from the body, sucking it into sealed containers. No water, no gravity, just fans, filters, and fear. Every astronaut is trained on how to use the space toilet before their mission. And this training isn't metaphorical. They literally practice strapping themselves in and aligning their trajectory using a toilet trainer with a built-in camera. That's right, the same people piloting space shuttles and repairing satellites also learn butt targeting as part of their job description. Because in zero gravity, Precision is everything. Miss the bowl, and you're not just making a mess, you're weaponizing waste in a sealed metal tube hurtling through space. As for where it all goes, urine gets processed and, wait for it, recycled into drinking water. The motto is essentially, yesterday's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. The purification process is extremely thorough, of course, but there's something deeply humbling about sipping on what used to be your crewmate's Gatorade. Waste, on the other hand, is stored in airtight bags, sealed and placed in a special container. Once full, the waste bags are loaded into a supply capsule, usually a resupply ship that has finished delivering food and gear, and jettisoned back toward Earth's atmosphere, where they burn up on re-entry like a fiery brown shooting star. Occasionally, they're loaded into spacecraft that continue orbiting for weeks or months before disintegrating. Yes, that means right now, there could be waste circling the Earth like some sort of cosmic reminder that even among the stars, humans are still very much human. And don't think for a second that this process is quiet or peaceful. The toilet fans are loud, the procedures are complicated, and even veteran astronauts have called it the least glamorous part of space travel. Some have compared the noise to a shop vacuum. Others have admitted they try to hold it as long as possible just to avoid the process altogether. But you have to admire the absurd poetry of it all. After millennia of chamber pots, castle moats, sponge sticks, and furniture toilets, humanity finally put a toilet in space. And it cost more than most houses. It required a team of scientists, engineers, and behavioral experts, and it taught us all that zero gravity plus bodily functions equals chaos, unless you really plan ahead. So yes, it cost millions to reinvent what cavemen did for free, but now your waste gets its own space mission. And that, dear listener, is the final flush tier. From squatting in the dirt to wasting in orbit, the history of toilets is less a tale of glamour and more a saga of perseverance, innovation, and the eternal human quest to just do your business in peace. You've come a long way, humanity. Now flush with pride. In the late 12th century, the city of Pisa had a vision, bold, glorious, and just a little bit wobbly. The plan? To build a magnificent bell tower to complete its gleaming new cathedral complex, already adorned with a cathedral, a baptistry, and a cemetery that was, in a very literal sense, dead quiet. Pisa wasn't just flexing its spiritual muscles, it was flexing its wealth, its status as a maritime powerhouse, and its medieval ambition to slap a giant vertical exclamation point on its skyline. So in 1173, construction began on what was supposed to be a towering symbol of prosperity, a white marble monument to architectural excellence. It would rise proudly beside the cathedral and baptistry, an elegant 8-story bell tower, or campanile, that would ring out to announce religious ceremonies, civic events, and possibly, "We did it first, Florence," messages. Everything was going great until gravity and geology teamed up to deliver the world's most famous architectural facepalm. By the time they hit the 3rd story, the workers noticed something off. Slight tilt. A whisper of a lean. Probably just an optical illusion, right? Medieval stone can do that. Besides, buildings settle. Nothing to panic about. That's what they told themselves. But the lean didn't stop. The tower was gently, steadily trying to moonwalk its way into the ground. Now, you might ask, didn't they test the soil? You sweet modern thinker. This was the 12th century. There were no geotechnical surveys, no boring rigs, no teams of engineers in reflective vests taking soil samples. There were just stonemasons, dreams, and a healthy dose of misplaced confidence. The builders plopped this massive 14,000-ton structure right on top of soft, silty, marsh-like soil, the kind of terrain that makes modern engineers break out in hives. Beneath Pisa was a mix of clay, sand, and ancient sludge, nature's version of a whoopee cushion. The result? The ground beneath one side began to compress, sinking under the weight, while the other side stubbornly refused to budge. The tower started doing what no tower should ever do, lean. The problem wasn't the design, at least not entirely. The architecture itself was standard Romanesque. Round arches, thick walls, decorative columns. The builders knew how to stack stones and build arches. What they didn't understand was subsurface physics. They built the base of the tower only about 10 feet deep, which is basically shallow enough to trip over. For a 180-foot tall structure, that's like trying to anchor a skyscraper on top of a marshmallow. Still, the builders pressed on, because what else are you going to do? Cancel the project and admit defeat? Not in Pisa. No, sir. They were on the architectural equivalent of a first date with a red flag. Maybe it'll fix itself. We just need to keep going. To be fair, medieval Europe was not exactly bursting with structural science. People built by tradition, trial and hope. The term load-bearing was more of a vibe than a calculation. So when the tower started leaning, they did what any overly confident project manager might do. Ignore it, smile, and keep stacking stones. And for a while it worked, sort of. The lean was slow and the marble was beautiful, and tourists hadn't been invented yet, so no one was making a fuss on social media. But deep down, everyone involved knew this wasn't going to be the pristine, picture-perfect tower they'd envisioned. Instead, it was becoming something else entirely, a bizarre, off-kilter monument that defied both gravity and good planning. And so Pisa's crowning achievement began its slow transformation into Pisa's most famous construction fail. The very moment it rose above the third level, it had already entered a category few buildings ever aspire to, likely to fall over, but not today. Of course, at the time, no one knew the tower would become an icon of lopsided resilience. Back then, it was just awkward. Imagine hosting a dinner party and realizing halfway through that the table you built is sinking on one side, and instead of fixing it, your guests just keep coming back every year, raving about how quirky it is. That's essentially Pisa's relationship with the leaning tower. A miscalculation so bold, so determined, and so photogenic that the world fell in love with it, literally at an angle. But in 1173, all they had was a dream, some marble, and a tower that had already decided vertical living just wasn't for it. The ground was like, nah, I don't do support. And Pisa, it just shrugged and kept building. If the last part was the part where Pisa accidentally invented a landmark by letting gravity win, then this part is where they doubled down on the disaster with the confidence of a medieval dad refusing to ask for directions. The Leaning Tower of Pisa wasn't just a building gone rogue. It was a case study in what happens when your entire engineering strategy can be summed up as keep stacking and hope for the best. After the initial lean became painfully obvious by the time builders reached the third story, the city faced a choice: scrap the project and admit the tower was listing like a ship caught in a strong breeze, or keep going and try to outwit physics with sheer optimism. Naturally, they went with the latter. But then fate intervened. Not with a solution, but with a pause, a very long one. Construction halted in 1178, only 5 years after it began. Not because anyone suddenly developed a sense of structural integrity, but because Pisa got involved in some classic medieval warfare. The city was engaged in a series of skirmishes with neighbors like Florence, Genoa, and Lucca, essentially the Italian version of a reality show, where every episode ends in sword fights and excommunication. Funding and focus were redirected to defending Pisa's honor, not its unbalanced bell tower. And so the half-built tower, already leaning like it was deep into wine-tasting season, sat untouched for nearly a century. Now here's the twist. This accidental delay might have saved the whole thing. The pause gave the soil beneath the foundation time to settle under the pressure of the first few floors. The soft ground compressed, shifted, and found some equilibrium. If they had kept building immediately, the added weight might have tipped the tower over like a domino. Instead, by doing absolutely nothing for decades, Pisa's mistake was sort of stabilized. The tower leaned, yes, but it leaned slowly. This gave Pisa time to regroup and return to the project with renewed confidence and zero new ideas. Because when work resumed in the 1270s, builders decided the best way to counteract the lean was to build taller on one side. Yes, that was the plan. Instead of trying to realign the structure or correct the foundation, which, to be fair, wasn't really an option with 13th century technology, They simply started stacking the next floors with one side taller than the other. The result? A tower that curved like a banana and leaned like it was trying to eavesdrop on the baptistry next door. It wasn't just tilting now, it was actively confused about which direction it was supposed to face. Picture this. You're playing Jenga, and one side starts to droop. Do you stop and reconfigure? No, you grab more blocks, pile them higher on the opposite side and declare, "It's abstract now." That was Pisa's vibe. If it can't be fixed, it can at least be aesthetically diagonal. To make matters even weirder, construction wasn't continuous. The tower's building timeline was like a relationship status on Facebook. It's complicated. Between wars, financial problems, and general disorganization, the construction process stretched over nearly 200 years, and each time the work resumed, new architects brought in their own brilliant fixes, none of which involved starting over or stabilizing the foundation. Instead, they tried little tweaks, adding counterweights, adjusting column heights, changing materials like medieval chiropractors, trying to gently persuade a spine back into place with no medical training. One solution involved adding heavier stones to the north side of the base to balance the lean to the south. It didn't work. Another tried reinforcing the base with lead weights, because if your tower is sinking, obviously metal blocks will help. These attempts weren't just ineffective, they arguably made the problem worse by constantly shifting the tower's center of gravity. And yet somehow it didn't fall. Part of the reason may have been the sheer luck of how the soil layers compressed, slowly, inconsistently, but just enough to keep things standing. Another reason. The tower was never meant to be very tall to begin with, just 8 stories, so the overall weight was slightly more forgiving, but mostly it endured because nobody built it fast enough to make it collapse. If anything, the delays gave the earth time to say, "Fine, I'll hold it." Barely. By the time the final floors and bell chamber were added in the 14th century, the Leaning Tower of Pisa had already become the medieval version of a meme. Not quite a failure, not quite a triumph, just famous for not doing what it was supposed to do. It was meant to be a vertical celebration of Pisa's religious and civic pride. Instead, it became a tilted, teetering reminder that sometimes even your biggest mistake can still become your most iconic feature. So yes, Pisa kept building, they kept guessing, they ignored the warnings, and the tower, it kept leaning, like stacking Jenga blocks on a waterbed and calling it architecture. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is absolutely nothing, and in Pisa's case, that nothing lasted nearly a century. Most architectural miracles are the result of careful planning, daring design, and technical brilliance. The Leaning Tower of Pisa, that miracle happened because everyone got distracted by war and forgot to finish building it. That's right, a century-long construction delay, caused by medieval Italian chaos, just so happened to become the only reason the whole thing didn't topple over like a drunk tourist on cobblestones. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1100s, and Pisa is still riding high as a maritime republic. They've started building their shiny new bell tower next to their cathedral, and it's supposed to be the final jewel in their architectural crown. But after just a few stories, the tower begins leaning to the south, thanks to some tragically squishy soil under the foundation. At this point, the builders had 2 options: stop building and reassess the structural integrity of the tower, or keep building until either God or gravity intervenes. They chose option 2 briefly, but in 1178, as the lean became increasingly obvious and harder to pass off as intentional medieval charm, Pisa found itself facing a much bigger problem: war. The city-state was locked in a not-so-friendly neighborhood dispute with its rivals, Florence, Genoa, and Lucca, who all seemed to wake up each morning asking, "What if we just invaded Pisa again today?" These weren't just petty spats either. They were full-blown turf wars between proud and powerful city-states, each trying to out-trade, out-fight, and out-glory the others. So naturally, the bell tower project, already a bit wobbly, got shoved to the bottom of Pisa's to-do list, right under "Don't Get Conquered." Construction halted, tools were put away, workers either went off to fight or got busy building defensive walls instead of increasingly diagonal monuments. and the Leaning Tower of Pisa was left to sit there, half-finished, and listing like a rejected marble lighthouse. And that, ironically, was the smartest accident Pisa ever made. See, when you stop piling weight onto a structure built on soft ground, something magical happens. The earth has time to settle. In engineering terms, this is known as soil consolidation, the process where soft, compressible ground gradually compacts under pressure. In real terms, it meant the tower stopped wobbling quite so aggressively and found something resembling balance. If Pisa had kept building, the structure would have been taller, heavier, and more likely to go full Pisa pancake. But thanks to the century-long pause, the foundation compressed at its own pace, stabilizing just enough to not tip the whole thing into a pile of regret and rubble. Think of it this way. Imagine you're inflating a giant bouncy castle on a patch of wet grass. If you keep jumping on it while it's inflating, the whole thing flops over. But if you give it time to fully rise, the ground beneath has time to firm up. That's what Pisa accidentally did. They gave their bouncy castle 100 years to think about what it had done. This pause gave Pisa a surprise gift, a second chance. But let's be clear, they didn't do this on purpose. No one in the 12th century stood back from the tower and said, "Gentlemen, I propose a bold plan. Let's not touch this for 90 years. No, it was pure procrastination, medieval style. The wars that distracted Pisa weren't even particularly effective. They lost key naval battles, and their influence waned while rivals like Genoa gained ground. But in terms of tower survival, 5 stars, would delay again. When construction finally resumed in the 1270s, the lean hadn't worsened. In fact, it had stabilized somewhat, thanks to that unexpected gift of time. This gave future architects the false confidence to start tinkering again, which we'll explore in the next chapter. But for this brief, glorious century of silence, the tower was allowed to just lean in peace. This also meant that the builders and designers of the next phase were working with a structure that had settled into a kind of awkward equilibrium, still very tilted, but not in imminent danger of keeling over. They now had the challenge of continuing construction on a slant, which is something no architectural school teaches, not even the experimental ones in Florence, where they also teach how to wear a feathered hat unironically. So in a strange twist of fate, the tower's very survival was secured by medieval indecision, external conflict, and sheer inaction. Pisa discovered quite accidentally that sometimes procrastination is an architectural lifesaver. They didn't pour concrete, they didn't reinforce anything, they didn't even redesign the foundation. They just forgot about it, long enough for gravity and geology to have a quiet heart-to-heart and agree to call a truce. It's poetic, really. While the rest of Europe was writing epic poems about knights and saints, Pisa wrote a sonnet in stone about how not doing anything at all might be the best decision a city could make. Turns out, doing absolutely nothing was the best structural decision they ever made. By the time Pisa rolled into the Renaissance, the Leaning Tower had been sitting at a permanent tilt for well over a century, like a stubborn guest at a dinner party who refuses to leave, insists a chair is level, and somehow becomes everyone's favorite conversation piece. The city had long since given up on pretending the tower would straighten itself. Instead, it embraced a bold new philosophy that future generations would recognize as the foundation of every group project ever. Let's just keep building and see what happens. The 14th and 15th centuries brought a fresh wave of ambition to Pisa. The Renaissance was blossoming across Italy. Art, science, and architecture were exploding like a creative fireworks show. While Florence was busy sculpting David and painting ceilings, Pisa's proudest project was still noticeably off-axis. But instead of scrapping the wobbly bell tower and starting fresh, Pisa's engineers took a uniquely Renaissance approach: lean into the lean. Literally, the new generation of architects didn't just inherit a half-finished bell tower, they inherited a 14,000-ton metaphor for poor planning. But they weren't quitters, they were thinkers, tinkerers, and very skilled improvisers. And so, construction resumed with what might be the greatest architectural compromise in history: curve the tower back the other way. Yes, this was the actual plan. not straighten it, not reinforce the foundation, just bend it. If the bottom half leaned south, they reasoned, why not build the upper stories with a slight counterlean to the north? Problem solved, right? Kind of? Sort of? Okay, not really. What it did result in was a tower that doesn't just lean, it visibly curves. The leaning tower isn't a smooth tilt like the Tower of Terror. It's a confused, zigzagging noodle of limestone. If you stare long enough, it looks like it's about to tip over and correct itself at the same time. It was like the building had an identity crisis halfway through construction. Wait, are we falling? Or are we just being dramatic? The upper levels were deliberately skewed to offset the lean, creating what engineers now lovingly call a banana profile. Imagine a child trying to fix a lopsided snowman by stacking the head slightly to the left, and then pretending it was intentional all along. That's what Pisa did, only with marble and bells. And it worked. Kind of. The tower didn't fall over, which by now was Pisa's primary metric of success. But more importantly, the people of Pisa were no longer trying to correct the error, they were styling it. The Leaning Tower had entered its Renaissance glow-up era. It wasn't broken, it was bespoke, custom, uniquely unbalanced, and nobody else had one like it. This shift in attitude was more than just survival instinct. It was marketing. Pisa realized that what they had wasn't a failure, it was an icon. Other cities had cathedrals, other cities had bell towers, but Pisa had the only tower that looked like it was trying to sneak out of a group photo. It drew pilgrims, poets, painters, and eventually thousands of very confused architects who traveled from across Europe just to ask, wait, they did what on the fourth floor? And here's the truly hilarious part. This whole wobbly, off-kilter mess still had to function as a bell tower. That meant installing giant bronze bells, very heavy, very swingy bells, into a structure that already had balance issues. It's like strapping a helicopter blade to the top of a weather vane. There were legitimate concerns that ringing the bells might shift the entire tower further off balance. So naturally, they just didn't ring the bells very often. Problem solved. Again, at this point, Pisa's whole approach to the tower could be described as high-stakes winging it, and yet the structure kept holding. Architects would tweak, adjust, nudge. The soil, strangely cooperative, continued to settle slowly, and over time the tower stopped being a problem and started being a legend. By the 15th century, the top floor and bell chamber were finally completed. The tower was done, and it was stunning, beautiful, even. 8 elegant stories of creamy white marble wrapped in Romanesque arches, standing proudly if not entirely vertically over the Campo dei Miracoli. From a distance it looked noble and grand. Get up close though, and you'd notice the lean, then the curve, then the distinct feeling that the entire building was doing its best not to fall over in public. In modern terms, we'd say Pisa gaslit the world into thinking this was intentional. It was the architectural equivalent of wearing mismatched socks and insisting it's a fashion statement. One side was vertical, the other was in full panic mode. The tower was basically catfishing people. Look at me. I'm a proud, symmetrical marvel of the Renaissance until you walk around to the south side and realize you're being lied to by geometry. And yet, somehow, all this nonsense gave the tower something no flawless building could achieve: personality, charm, a strangely endearing sense of struggle. It wasn't perfect, but it looked like it tried, and that made it unforgettable. So Pisa's grand rescue mission wasn't really about saving a tower. It was about owning the failure so confidently that it became a global triumph. Lean and proud. By the time the 20th century rolled around, the Leaning Tower of Pisa had spent 7 centuries defying logic, gravity, and every reasonable expectation of what a tower should do. It leaned, it wobbled, it flirted with collapse like it was part of a medieval drama, and yet it stood. It also became wildly famous, not in a "what a stunning piece of Romanesque architecture" kind of way, but in a "oh my gosh, it's still standing" sort of tone. The Leaning Tower had evolved from construction fail to cultural icon, the kind of place where tourists came to awkwardly pose like they were holding it up with their fingertips while secretly praying it wouldn't fall mid-selfie. But while the tourists were thrilled, engineers were quietly losing their minds. By the early 1900s, the lean was getting worse. Not dramatically so, but noticeably. The tilt had reached over 5 degrees, meaning the top of the tower hung almost 15 feet off-center from where it was supposed to be. That's not just quirky, that's a structural cry for help. And engineers began to worry that the charming landmark might suddenly become a charming pile of rubble. Then, in 1989, Italy got a terrifying wake-up call. A medieval civic tower in Pavia, not far from Pisa, collapsed without warning, killing 4 people. That tower, too, had been old, heavy, and seemingly stable until it wasn't. Suddenly, the idea of letting Pisa's tower just keep leaning didn't feel so romantic anymore. It felt reckless. Tourists were literally climbing to the top every day, unaware that they might be taking selfies on a granite Jenga tower nearing its final move. So, in 1990, the government finally closed the tower to the public. No more climbing, no more selfies, just a bunch of very serious engineers descending on Pisa like it was the world's most picturesque crime scene. Their mission? Stabilize the leaning tower without actually making it stop leaning. Because here's the hilarious twist. The world loved this tower precisely because it looked like it was about to fall over. If engineers accidentally straightened it out, they wouldn't just ruin a building, they'd destroy an identity. Pisa wasn't about to become home to the formerly leaning, now bland-looking tower. That doesn't get you postcards or busloads of tourists. That gets you polite nods and economic collapse. So, how do you fix something without fixing it too much? Enter the world's most absurdly delicate rescue operation. First, the tower was anchored with steel cables to keep it from leaning further while they worked. Then came the experimental methods, adding lead weights to the north side of the tower, the side opposite the lean, to counterbalance it. These were literally giant chunks of metal stacked like gym plates, weighing hundreds of tons. It was like trying to stop a slow-motion car crash by throwing dumbbells at it. But the lead only helped so much. What really made the difference was an innovative and slightly terrifying technique called soil extraction. The idea was simple. Remove small amounts of earth from underneath the north side of the tower. That would allow it to settle just a tiny bit, nudging the foundation back into a slightly less suicidal angle. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, well, you're deliberately destabilizing the foundation of a nearly 1,000-year-old tower. One bad scoop, and it's Pisa pancake time. Fortunately, the team was meticulous. Soil was removed millimeter by millimeter over the course of years, with engineers monitoring every tiny shift in the structure like worried parents watching a toddler wobble near a staircase. They used laser scanners, tilt sensors, and every modern tool available to track the tower's every breath, and it worked. By the early 2000s, the tilt had been reduced by about 17 inches, bringing it back to the angle it had in the early 1800s. Not vertical, not straight, but stable. For the first time in centuries, the leaning tower wasn't leaning more each year. It was holding steady, like an aging rock star that's finally sworn off stage diving. Even better, it still looked delightfully off-kilter. The character remained intact. Pisa kept its brand. Tourists returned in droves, thrilled that the tower was still a hazard, but now a well-managed one. It was the architectural equivalent of installing guardrails on a haunted roller coaster. Still terrifying, but now certified safe by science. So yes, engineers spent millions, literally hundreds of millions, on a project that didn't fix the lean, but stopped it from leaning too hard. It wasn't about correcting the past. It was about preserving the past's biggest oops in a way that felt deliberate, like turning a spilled cup of wine into abstract art and charging admission. And perhaps most hilariously, the Leaning Tower of Pisa now has a dedicated international monitoring team, a group of scientists and preservationists who regularly check its tilt, soil pressure, temperature, and general mood. That's right, somewhere right now, a trained expert is watching a 900-year-old tower to make sure it continues to lean just the right amount. Because in the end, Pisa's most precious landmark isn't a mistake that was fixed, It's a mistake that was frozen in time, carefully managed like a celebrity with just the right amount of scandal. Engineers spent millions making sure the tower could keep failing safely, and honestly, that's the kind of commitment we should all aspire to. If you ever feel bad about messing something up, just remember, Pisa built a tower incorrectly, couldn't fix it, and now millions of people travel from around the world just to laugh at it, take pictures with it, and give the city their money. It's possibly the greatest oops-to-income conversion in human history. The Leaning Tower of Pisa went from architectural embarrassment to global celebrity, and no one in Pisa is mad about it because the lean pays the bills. The tower doesn't do anything. It doesn't host concerts. There are no fireworks. It doesn't shoot lasers or transform into a robot. It just leans, and people are obsessed with it. Somehow that slightly off-center cylinder has managed to wedge itself into the global consciousness as one of Europe's must-see landmarks. Why? Because it's so spectacularly wrong that it feels right. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is the Mona Lisa of construction fails. Slightly odd, world-famous, and surrounded by tourists trying to get the perfect photo with it. Now don't be fooled into thinking this was always the plan. Pisa didn't lean into the lean on purpose, it was forced to after centuries of architectural denial. But over time, as the tower refused to collapse and the lean grew more dramatic, it started attracting attention. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European travelers on the Grand Tour were already including Pisa in their itineraries, largely so they could point at the tower and go, "Huh, that's not right." But it was the 20th century, and particularly the rise of international tourism after World War II, that turned the tower into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. As planes got faster and cameras got smaller, Pisa became the perfect pit stop for travelers seeking something weird, old, and photo-worthy. After all, how many places let you feel like a structural engineer just by standing at an angle? And then came the golden age of the gag photo. For reasons no one fully understands, the tower triggered a worldwide urge to pretend to hold it up. You know the pose. One arm outstretched, back slightly arched, face frozen in forced concentration, as if your bare hands are keeping this 1,000-year-old monument from tipping into history. It's not original. It's not even convincing, but it's irresistible. Today, on any given day, hundreds of people can be seen bending at the waist, arms out like confused karate instructors, posing for the exact same photo their parents took in 1984. It's become an international rite of passage. Visit Pisa, do the pose, upload it to Instagram, get 10 comments saying, "LOL, I did that too." Repeat. But while tourists are busy posing, Pisa is busy cashing in. The Leaning Tower alone brings in millions of euros every year, not just from entry tickets, but from the sprawling ecosystem of tourism that feeds off it. The city sells keychains, magnets, miniature towers, t-shirts, mugs, leaning wine bottles, leaning candles, leaning soap dispensers, you name it, and there's a version of it trying to tip over. There are hotels with tower view rooms, cafes with tower-shaped pastries, even pasta shaped like the building's spiraling columns. Pisa has taken a construction mishap and turned it into a brand, and that brand works. The tower, as part of the Piazza dei Miracoli, Square of Miracles, became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. That official stamp of historical importance ensured not just preservation funding, but a steady stream of culturally minded tourists who could now visit a collapsing tower and feel deeply enlightened about it. But beyond the economics, there's something charmingly human about the tower's popularity. It's not sleek, it's not intimidating, it's relatable. We've all felt a little off balance. We've all had days where we stood at a weird angle and hoped no one noticed. The Leaning Tower just embraced it, leaned into the discomfort, and somehow became more beloved because of it. Even better, it gives tourists a rare opportunity to feel like they're part of the story. Standing beside the tower doesn't just make you a viewer, it turns you into a character. Every photo of someone pretending to prop it up is part of a centuries-long inside joke shared by millions, a communal wink at history. And as for Pisa, the city has become the living proof that you don't have to be perfect to be profitable. One mistake, left unfixed and lovingly maintained, has brought in enough revenue to support a local economy, fund restoration projects, and make Pisa one of Italy's most recognizable cities, even though most tourists can't name anything else in it. So the next time you feel like life is off kilter, remember, the Leaning Tower has been teetering for over 800 years, and people still love it. It's the only construction fail where tourists bring money and bend at the waist for selfies. There are perfect buildings in the world. Symmetrical, flawless, feats of engineering so precise they could double as math problems. And then there's the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the slightly confused, perpetually sideways, unapologetically flawed monument that's captured the world's heart for over 8 centuries. It's the architectural version of that friend who can't walk in heels but still shows up to the party and somehow becomes the center of attention. And the legacy? Nothing short of legendary. Because make no mistake, the Leaning Tower of Pisa is not just famous for being old or tall or white and made of marble. It's famous because it shouldn't be standing, and yet there it is, smiling lopsidedly at the world, like a drunk uncle at a wedding who refuses to sit down, and behaves just well enough to keep getting invited to the next one. Today, the tower has taken on a meaning far beyond its original religious function. It was meant to be a bell tower, an elegant topper to a grand cathedral complex. But nobody remembers the bells. Nobody visits Pisa to listen to the delicate chime of medieval bronze echoing across the Piazza dei Miracoli. No, they come to marvel at a building that has been trying to fall for 800 years and still hasn't managed it. It has become a global symbol of imperfection embraced, a monument not to what humans did right, but to what they did wrong, and then refused to give up on. Most buildings get demolished for foundational flaws. Pisa, it just became famous for leaning into it, and that lean is now actively protected. Yes, modern engineers have performed their math-based miracles to stabilize the tower, see Chapter 5. But the job didn't end there. The Leaning Tower of Pisa is now one of the most closely monitored structures on Earth. It has sensors embedded deep in its foundation, constantly measuring tilt, vibrations, temperature, and soil conditions, like a high-maintenance celebrity with a team of stylists and wellness coaches checking its every move. Twice a year, a team of international experts flies in to check that the tower is still doing what it does best, not falling over. And not just because of safety, though that's important. The real goal is to preserve the lean, not fix it, but maintain it. Because Pisa knows that if the tower ever stood up straight, the spell would break. The tower's lean is now part of its identity, and Pisa treats it the way some people treat a crooked nose or an out-of-tune piano that still plays your favorite song. You don't fix it, you protect it, you nurture it, you give it an Instagram account and let the world love it for what it is. This commitment has helped transform Pisa from that city with the tilted tower to a global brand, and not a temporary trend either. This is a city that's leaned hard, pun intended, into marketing their iconic accident. Think about it. You don't see Paris putting the Eiffel Tower on dish towels with the phrase "oops" underneath it. But Pisa? Pisa made the lean a lifestyle. It's on socks, mugs, aprons, snow globes, mascots, wedding cakes, and probably tattoos. They even launched marketing campaigns using slogans like "It's not a mistake, it's a miracle," and "Always leaning forward." It's part cheeky self-awareness, part brilliant tourism psychology. The Leaning Tower has become one of the few monuments in the world where the floor is the feature. In a time where we idolize perfection, perfect bodies, perfect homes, perfectly filtered vacation photos, the tower reminds us that lasting greatness doesn't require symmetry. You don't need to stand straight to stand tall. You don't have to be flawless to be beloved. Sometimes, being just a little off is exactly what makes you unforgettable. And the people? They come by the millions. They come from every continent. They come in buses, on foot, with selfie sticks in one hand and cappuccinos in the other. And they do the same pose, again and again, pretending to hold it up, pretending to push it over, sometimes pretending to be squashed underneath it. It's global ritual, repeated daily, in honor of a building that failed so beautifully it became immortal. Even poets, philosophers, and engineers can't help but admire it, because in a world full of architectural perfection, there's something deeply reassuring about a building that refused to be what it was supposed to be and still managed to make everyone fall in love. So yes, it's been leaning for 800 years, which frankly is more stability than most relationships. And in that time, it's become more than a tower. It's a metaphor, a meme, a love letter to stubbornness, resilience, and accidental greatness. It's not just standing, it's slouching toward legend.